Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Blackwood estate stood like a monument to decay against the October sky, its Gothic spires piercing the gray clouds that had gathered since my arrival. As a real estate photographer, I documented hundreds of properties, but none had made my camera feel quite so heavy in my hands. The auction house had been clear. Capture every room, every angle, every detail that might entice potential buyers. What they hadn't mentioned was the way shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, or how the silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. I pushed through the massive oak doors, their hinges protesting with a low groan that echoed through the empty foyer. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through tall windows, creating an ethereal haze that made the grand staircase appear to dissolve at its edges. The air tasted of old wood and something else, something metallic and stale that coated my tongue unpleasantly. My first shots were routine. Wide angles of the main hall, detail work on the carved banister, the ornate chandelier hanging like a crystalline spider from the vaulted ceiling. Through my viewfinder, everything appeared normal, predictable even. It wasn't until I reviewed the images on my camera's LCD screen that I noticed it. A blur of gray, vaguely human in shape, standing just behind and to the left of where I'd been positioned. The figure was indistinct, as if caught mid-movement or shrouded in fog, but unmistakably present in every frame I'd taken. I felt my pulse quicken as I scrolled through the images. Each photograph contained the same anomaly, always behind me, always just outside my peripheral vision, always that same nebulous form wrapped in what looked like vapor or smoke. My rational mind suggested camera malfunction, lens condensation, or tricks of the light. But the consistency of the appearance unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Moving to the library, I tried different settings, cleaned my lens meticulously, even switched to a backup camera. The room was a photographer's dream. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, and filtered sunlight creating dramatic shadows across Persian rugs. Yet as I worked, I felt increasingly watched, as if unseen eyes tracked my every movement. The sensation intensified when I discovered that the new photos showed the same gray presence, now appearing closer, more defined. In one image, I could almost make out facial features, the suggestion of hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and what might have been a thin smile. My hands began to tremble slightly as I continued through the house. Each room yielded beautiful shots marred by that persistent, impossible figure. In the dining room, it stood beside the mahogany table. In the conservatory, it lingered among the dead plants. In the master bedroom, it seemed to lean over the antique four-poster bed with what appeared to be curiosity or longing. It was in the study that I found the journals. Hidden behind a false panel I'd discovered while photographing the built-in bookshelves, 3 leather-bound volumes sat wrapped in oiled cloth. Dr. Ephraim Blackwood's name was embossed in gold on each cover, along with dates spanning from 1887 to 1889. Against my better judgment, I opened the first volume. The handwriting was precise, scientific, but the content made my skin crawl. Dr. Blackwood had been conducting what he called spectral photography, attempting to capture and bind human souls using chemical processes and arcane rituals. His notes described experiments with silver plates treated with strange compounds, exposure times calculated according to lunar phases, and subjects who had volunteered for his research. The boundary between the visible and invisible realms, he wrote, is far thinner than modern science acknowledges. With the proper techniques, one can not only observe the spiritual essence but trap it, preserve it, study it indefinitely. As afternoon gave way to evening, I found myself compulsively reading. Blackwood's final entries grew increasingly frantic. His last successful subject, a man named Thomas Ashford, had apparently become problematically adherent to the photographic process. The spirit wouldn't release from the plates, wouldn't move on to whatever realm awaited it. Instead, it had begun manifesting around anyone who entered the laboratory with photographic equipment. It seeks to complete the binding, Blackwood wrote in his final legible entry. Thomas has learned to transfer his attachment from plate to plate, camera to camera. He hungers for the moment of capture, the click of the shutter that promises him continued existence in our world. I fear I have created something that cannot be undone. The final pages were nearly illegible, the handwriting deteriorating into desperate scrawls about failed exorcisms and abandoned experiments. The last entry was a single line. It follows the lens now. God help whoever next aims a camera in this house. Darkness had fallen while I read, and the mansion around me seemed to pulse with new meaning. Every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind through broken seals, felt charged with possibility and threat. I gathered my equipment, suddenly desperate to leave, but found myself drawn back to my camera's memory. The most recent photos showed the figure with startling clarity. No longer a gray blur, Thomas Ashford, for I was now certain that's who it was, appeared as a gaunt man in period clothing, his eyes fixed directly on the camera lens with an expression of desperate hunger. In the final image, taken just before I'd found the journals, he appeared to be reaching toward the camera, his fingers nearly touching the frame's edge. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and flee, but something kept me rooted in place. Perhaps it was professional obligation, or maybe simple curiosity, but I found myself raising the camera again, aiming it at the empty air where I felt his presence most strongly. The viewfinder showed nothing unusual, just the study's bookcases and shadows. But when I pressed the shutter, the flash illuminated something that made my breath catch. For just an instant, I saw him clearly, not through the camera, but with my own eyes. Thomas Ashford stood 3 feet away, his mouth open in what might have been speech or a silent scream, his hands stretched toward me in supplication or threat. The flash faded, plunging the room back into darkness, but I could still feel him there, closer now. The temperature around me seemed to drop several degrees, and my breath began forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. I lowered the camera with shaking hands and checked the image. There he was, clearer than ever, but something had changed. The hunger in his expression had been replaced by something else. Recognition, perhaps, or satisfaction. And behind him, barely visible in the photograph's background, stood another figure, then another, and another. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing. Dr. Blackwood's other subjects, all trapped in the same liminal space, all drawn to the camera's promise of existence. They stood in a crowd behind Thomas, their faces bearing the same desperate hope, the same terrible need. I fumbled for the journals again, searching for some indication of how to break the binding, how to release them from whatever photographic purgatory they inhabited. But as I read by the camera's LCD glow, I began to understand the horrible truth. There was no release. Blackwood had tried everything, destroying the original plates, burning his equipment, even attempting to photograph empty rooms to dilute their presence. Nothing worked. The spirits had learned to transfer themselves, to exist in the space between reality and image, feeding off the moment of capture, growing stronger with each photograph taken in their presence. And I had been feeding them all day. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every click of my shutter had been an invitation, every flash a doorway. I had been strengthening their connection to this world, making them more real, more permanent. The photos weren't just capturing their presence, they were creating it. I heard movement in the hallway outside the study, the soft shuffle of feet that shouldn't exist. When I looked up from the journal, I saw them reflected in the study's dark windows, not just Thomas, but all of them, standing in a loose circle around my position. Their faces were clearer now, more solid, as if my photographs had been slowly developing them back into existence. The camera in my hands felt suddenly hot, its metal body warming against my palms despite the room's growing chill. The LCD screen flickered, displaying images I hadn't taken, shots of the empty mansion from impossible angles, as if the camera were moving through the halls on its own, documenting every shadow, every corner where the spirits might hide. I tried to turn the camera off, but the power button wouldn't respond. The device seemed to have developed a will of its own, the lens adjusting focus with tiny mechanical whispers, the flash charging with an electronic whine that grew louder and more insistent. The spirits pressed closer, their forms gaining substance with each passing moment. I could see individual details now, the texture of their period clothing, the lines etched by suffering on their faces, the way their eyes reflected the camera's glow like those of nocturnal animals. Thomas stepped forward, his mouth moving in silent words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to tell me something about the ritual, about the way out, but his voice existed in a frequency my ears couldn't access. Only the camera could bridge that gap, could translate his spectral communication into something comprehensible. Against every rational thought, I raised the camera again. This time, when I looked through the viewfinder, I could see not just the spirits, but the traces of Blackwood's laboratory, equipment that had been removed decades ago, phantom tables and instruments overlaying the study's current arrangement like a double exposure. I pressed the shutter. The flash erupted with blinding intensity, far brighter than any I'd ever seen. In that moment of illumination, I saw everything. The complete ritual circle drawn in substances that had long since been cleaned away, the positioning of cameras and plates that no longer existed, and Thomas at the center of it all, finally able to speak. "Break the cameras," his voice echoed in my mind, clear as if he'd spoken directly into my ear. "All of them, before dawn, or we all become permanent." The flash faded, leaving me blinking in the darkness. When my vision cleared, the spirits were gone, but I knew they weren't far. They were inside the camera now, waiting, contained but not released. The LCD screen showed the last image I'd taken, but the figures in it were moving, pacing back and forth within the frame's confines like caged animals. I looked at my watch. 11:47 p.m. Dawn was still hours away, but I could feel time pressing against me like a physical weight. The camera was growing warmer in my hands, its electronic components humming with energy that shouldn't have been possible. Standing in that dark study, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of a man whose experiments had torn holes in reality itself, I faced a choice that would define not just my night, but possibly my existence. The spirits had shown me the way out, but following their advice meant destroying equipment worth thousands of dollars, abandoning a contract that could make or break my career. More importantly, it meant trusting the word of something that might not even be real. As I wrestled with the decision, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The camera's memory card counter was increasing on its own, showing new images being captured, even though I wasn't pressing the shutter. The spirits weren't just contained in my previous photos. They were actively using the camera now, documenting the world from their perspective, adding their own images to my memory cards. I scrolled through the new pictures with growing horror. They showed the mansion from impossible angles, shots taken from inside walls, from beneath floorboards, from perspectives that no living photographer could achieve. In several images, I could see myself working earlier in the day, unaware of the figures standing just behind me, their hands almost touching my shoulders. The final image in the sequence showed my face from just inches away, as if the camera had been held directly in front of me while I slept. But I hadn't been sleeping, and I certainly hadn't taken that photograph. That's when I realized the truth that Dr. Blackwood had discovered too late. The spirits weren't trapped in the photographs. They were the photographers now, using any camera in their presence to document their expanding reality, to pull more of themselves into the visible world with each captured image. And I was no longer the one in control of the camera. The LCD screen flickered again, displaying a message in text that appeared letter by letter, as if typed by invisible hands. "Thank you for the invitation. We have been so lonely." Outside, the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon. I had perhaps an hour before sunrise, before whatever process Blackwood had started reached its completion. The camera was no longer warm. It was burning hot, its plastic casing beginning to soften under my fingers. I made my choice. But as I raised the camera above my head, preparing to smash it against the study's stone floor, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window. Standing behind me, clearer than they'd ever been, were dozens of figures in period dress. and they were all smiling. The camera slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor without breaking. As I bent to retrieve it, I noticed something that made my heart stop completely. My reflection in the window was beginning to flicker, becoming translucent around the edges, taking on the same ethereal quality as the spirits that surrounded me. I looked down at my hands and watched them fade slightly, then solidify, then fade again, as if my very existence was becoming negotiable. The camera lay at my feet, its LCD screen now showing a live feed of the room from an angle that suggested it was floating several feet above the floor. In the image, I could see myself standing among the spirits, but I was no longer distinguishable from them. We were all the same gray, all the same desperate hunger made visible. I reached for the camera one last time, but my fingers passed through it like smoke. Dawn was breaking through the windows, painting the study in shades of gold and amber. But I could no longer feel the warmth of the light, could no longer hear the sounds of the waking world outside. I existed now only in the space between moments, in the pause between the shutters click and the flashes fade. The Blackwood estate still stands, and they still conduct tours for potential buyers. I know because I've seen the photographers who come to document it, watch them work through viewfinders they'll never understand, are no longer entirely their own. They always notice the gray figures in their photographs. They always find the journals. They always think they're the first to discover Dr. Blackwood's terrible legacy. But they're not alone behind their cameras. We're there with them, learning their techniques, borrowing their equipment, adding our own images to their memory cards. Each new photographer brings fresh technology, new possibilities for documentation, new ways to expand our collection. The auction listing for the Blackwood estate has been updated again. They're looking for another photographer, someone to capture the property's unique character and historical significance. I hope whoever takes the job understands that some things, once captured, prefer to stay that way. And I hope they remember to break their camera before dawn, though I suspect, like all the others, they won't. Story 2. The first thing you notice about true silence is how it amplifies everything else. I discovered this 3 weeks after purchasing the chest at the Henderson farm auction, when the familiar rhythm of my workshop, the whisper of sandpaper against wood, the soft tick of the wall clock, even the distant hum of the refrigerator, had become as natural as breathing. But when I stopped working, when I set down my tools and let the silence settle like dust over everything, that's when the chest began to sing. Not sing exactly, more like a low thrumming, barely perceptible, as if the wood itself was vibrating at a frequency just below human hearing. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before your ears catch it. I'd been restoring furniture for 15 years, specializing in pieces with history, the kind that families reluctantly part with when estates are settled or mortgages go unpaid. The Henderson auction had been typical in its melancholy. A century-old farmhouse emptied of its memories, everything from hand-carved wardrobes to chipped china laid out under the harsh October sun for strangers to appraise and bid upon. The chest had caught my eye immediately. Heavy oak construction, probably mid-1800s, with brass corner guards tarnished black and a patina that spoke of decades spent in humid basements or neglected attics. The lock was broken, hanging open like a slack jaw, and the interior reeked of mildew and something else, something metallic and stale that reminded me uncomfortably of old blood. But it was the craftsmanship that sold me. Dovetail joints so precise they seemed to flow into one another, and a lid that, despite its age, still fitted with the kind of tolerance that spoke of a master carpenter. I bid $75 and felt like I'd stolen it. The first week of restoration had been routine. I'd stripped away layers of grime and neglect, revealing wood grain so beautiful it made my chest ache. The brass had polished to a warm gold, and the broken lock, a simple tumbler mechanism, was an easy fix with parts from my supplier in Philadelphia. It was while sanding the lid that I found them. Symbols, not carved exactly, but pressed deep into the wood as if burned there with a brand. They followed the grain in flowing lines that reminded me of Arabic script, though I couldn't be certain. Some resembled nautical charts I'd seen in maritime museums, compass roses and directional markers, while others defied any classification I could imagine. At first, they were barely visible, shadows in the wood that only appeared under direct light at certain angles. But as I worked, removing layers of old stain and wax, they became more pronounced, more insistent. That's when the humming started. Initially, I assumed it was the old pipes in the basement workshop where I'd set up my equipment. The building had been constructed in the 1920s, and the heating system groaned and whispered constantly. But this sound was different, organic somehow, with an irregular rhythm that reminded me of breathing. I found myself working later into the evenings, partly because the symbols seemed clearer under artificial light, but mostly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the chest wanted my attention. Which was ridiculous, of course. Furniture doesn't want anything, but alone in the workshop, with only the work light creating a small circle of warmth against the darkness, I began to understand why people believed in haunted objects. The chest dominated the space now, positioned on my main workbench like an altar. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that made my eyes water when I tried to focus. And the humming was getting louder. By the third week, I'd stopped pretending it was the pipes. The sound came specifically from the chest, rising and falling with an almost musical quality that made my skin crawl. More disturbing was my growing certainty that the sound was trying to communicate something, not through words, but through tone and rhythm, like a language of pure emotion. It was pulling me somewhere. The realization came gradually, the way fever builds in your body until you suddenly notice you're burning up. Every time the humming started, always during those moments of perfect silence, my attention was drawn inexorably toward the floor. Not just toward it, but through it, as if there was something below the concrete foundation that demanded acknowledgement. The basement. I'd been down there exactly once, when I'd first rented the space 6 years ago. It was unfinished, bare stone walls weeping moisture, a dirt floor, and a pervasive smell of decay that made breathing unpleasant. I'd stored some surplus lumber down there initially, but the dampness had warped it beyond use, and I'd eventually moved everything upstairs. Now, standing in my workshop with the chest humming its ancient song, I found myself remembering details I'd forgotten. The way the basement seemed to extend further than the building's footprint should have allowed. The feeling of being watched from the darker corners where my flashlight beam couldn't penetrate. The sound my footsteps had made on the packed earth, not echoing, but absorbed, as if the ground itself was listening. I tried working with headphones after that, but the humming seemed to resonate through my skull regardless of volume. Classical music, rock, even white noise, nothing could mask the chest's persistent call. That's when I heard the first voice. It happened on a Thursday evening, late enough that the street outside had gone quiet. I'd been applying the final coat of protective wax to the restored brass when the humming suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. Then, from somewhere below, a man spoke. I couldn't understand the words. They were in a language I didn't recognize, with rolling consonants and a cadence that suggested pleading. But the emotion was unmistakable, desperate, urgent need. I found myself moving toward the basement door without conscious decision, my hand already reaching for the light switch before rational thought reasserted itself. I stopped, heart hammering against my ribs, and forced myself to remain in the workshop. The voice came again, joined by others. A chorus of male voices speaking in what sounded like different languages. Spanish, maybe. Something that might have been Portuguese. And others I couldn't identify. All with the same pleading tone. All seeming to come from directly beneath my feet. All saying what sounded like the same word, over and over. Voltar. I knew enough Spanish to recognize it meant return or come back. That night I researched the chest's history with an obsession that would have embarrassed me under normal circumstances. The Henderson family records were sparse, but I eventually traced the piece to a Captain Josiah Middleton, who'd owned it during the 1840s. Middleton had commanded merchant vessels operating out of Charleston and Savannah, though the specific nature of his trade wasn't documented in any records I could find. It wasn't until I expanded my search to ship manifests and port records that the picture became clear. Middleton had been a slaver. The chest had belonged to a man who'd spent 20 years transporting human cargo from West Africa to the plantations of the American South. And according to a memoir I found in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, Middleton had experienced what his contemporaries called a crisis of conscience in his final years. The memoir, written by a Charleston minister who'd counseled Middleton before his death, described the captain's obsession with performing some kind of ritual that would release the souls of the innocent from their earthly bonds. Middleton had apparently believed that the spirits of everyone who died during his voyages, hundreds of men, women, and children, were trapped in a state of limbo, unable to find peace until they were properly acknowledged and sent home. The minister had dismissed this as the ravings of a man driven mad by guilt, but the memoir included detailed descriptions of ceremonies Middleton had attempted, using his personal chest as a focal point. The captain believed the chest could serve as a portal, a way for the trapped souls to finally return to their ancestral lands. The rituals had never worked. Middleton died in 1854, still believing he'd failed in his duty to the dead. Reading this, alone in my workshop at 3 a.m. with the chest humming its ceaseless song, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The voices from the basement had grown more frequent over the past few days, and I'd begun to distinguish individual speakers. Always men, always pleading in languages I couldn't understand, always asking to return, always asking me to help them, because that's what they were doing, I realized. They weren't just speaking, they were speaking to me. The way their voices rose when I approached the basement door, the way the humming intensified when I worked on the chest, the way the symbols seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was all directed at me, personally. They wanted me to finish what Middleton had started. The next few days blurred together in a haze of insomnia and growing paranoia. I couldn't leave the workshop. The voices became agitated when I went upstairs, rising to an almost desperate wail that seemed to follow me wherever I went in the building. But staying meant enduring their constant presence, their relentless pleading, their absolute certainty that I was the one who could help them. I stopped eating regularly, stopped showering, stopped returning phone calls from clients wondering about their own restoration projects. The outside world felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the urgent need radiating from the basement. The chest had become the center of everything. I found myself arranging the workshop around it, moving tools and supplies to create a clear circle around the workbench where it sat. The symbols on the lid were fully visible now, seeming to glow with their own internal light that had nothing to do with the fluorescent bulbs overhead, and I was beginning to understand them. Not intellectually, I still couldn't read them like text, but their meaning was becoming clear in the same way you might understand the emotional content of music without knowing the specific notes being played. They were instructions, a map, a recipe for opening a doorway between this world and whatever lay beyond. The voices were getting stronger too. What had started as whispers from the basement now filled the entire workshop. Dozens of different men speaking in overlapping languages that somehow formed a coherent harmony. They spoke of home, verdant coastlines and red earth, families left behind, children who would never know their fathers' faces. They spoke of the deep water and the weight of chains, and the endless darkness of cargo holds, where men had become numbers on a shipping manifest. And they spoke of their hope that finally, someone would finish the ritual that would let them go home. On the 7th night, I went down to the basement, not because I'd made a conscious decision, but because the voices had become so insistent that I found myself descending the narrow stairs without memory of how I'd gotten there. The flashlight in my hand illuminated a space that seemed larger than I remembered, stretching back into shadows that swallowed the beam long before it should have reached the far wall. The voices were louder here, coming from the packed earth floor as if dozens of men were buried just beneath my feet. I could hear them clearly now, individual words, phrases, entire sentences in languages that my conscious mind didn't recognize, but that some deeper part of me understood perfectly. They were giving me instructions. The chest, they explained, needed to be brought down here, to this liminal space between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The symbols needed to be activated, not by reading them, but by pressing my hands against them while speaking the words they were teaching me. Words in languages I'd never learned but somehow knew. Words that would open the door they'd been waiting over a century to walk through. I climbed back upstairs and stared at the chest, my hands shaking with exhaustion and something that might have been anticipation. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about psychotic breaks and carbon monoxide poisoning and the dangers of sleep deprivation. But that voice seemed thin and distant compared to the urgent need emanating from below. The men in the basement weren't asking for much, just acknowledgement. Just the chance to go home after more than a century of waiting. Just someone to finish what Captain Middleton had started and failed to complete. Just someone to care enough about their suffering to act. I picked up the chest. It was heavier than it should have been, as if it contained more than just empty space and old wood. The symbols under my hands seemed to pulse with warmth, and the humming that had started this entire ordeal now filled my head with such intensity that I could barely think. But I could feel them. Dozens of souls pressing close, guiding my movements, whispering encouragement as I carried their only hope toward the basement stairs. The door stood open below me, leading down into darkness that no longer seemed threatening but welcoming. Expectant. Home. I took the first step down, then the second, the voices rising around me in what might have been celebration, or might have been my own mind finally surrendering to the isolation and stress of the past month. The chest grew heavier with each step, or perhaps I was growing weaker. But it didn't matter. Almost there. Almost home. Almost finished. The basement floor felt soft beneath my feet, like sand on a distant shore. I set the chest down carefully, reverently, and placed my hands on the symbols carved into its lid. They were warm now, almost hot, and I could feel them moving under my palms like living things. The words came without thought, spilling from my lips in languages I'd never spoken but had always known. The air around me began to thicken, taking on weight and substance until it felt like I was breathing water. And in that thickness, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the shadows at the edge of my vision, waiting. Men of every age, wearing the remnants of clothing from a dozen different cultures, all watching me with expressions of desperate hope. Behind them, others, women and children, families torn apart by the institution that had brought them to this place and trapped them here. They reached toward me with hands that cast no shadows, spoke to me with voices that made no sound, pleaded with me to complete the ritual that would set them free. I pressed harder against the symbols, spoke the words faster, felt the chest begin to vibrate beneath my hands as something fundamental about the space around me began to change. The boundary between here and there was thinning, becoming permeable, allowing passage for souls that had been denied rest for far too long. The chest opened. Not physically. The lid remained closed beneath my hands. But something inside it opened, creating a passage that I felt rather than saw. A doorway back to the lands these people had been stolen from, back to the families that had mourned them, back to the peace they'd been denied for over a century. One by one they stepped forward and disappeared, not into the chest, but through it, using it as a bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond. I felt each passage like a weight lifting from my shoulders, a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying finally being set down. The last to go was a young man, barely out of his teens, who paused to look directly at me before following the others. His mouth moved in what might have been a word of thanks, or farewell, or blessing. Then they were gone, and I was alone in the basement with an empty chest and the gradually fading echo of voices that had finally found their way home. I climbed back upstairs as dawn broke through the workshop windows, carrying the chest that now felt as light as it looked. The symbols on its lid had faded back to barely visible impressions in the wood, and the humming that had dominated my world for the past month was finally, blessedly silent. But as I set the chest back on my workbench and looked around the workshop that I could barely remember leaving, I found myself wondering about the rational explanations I'd dismissed so easily, about carbon monoxide and psychotic breaks and the very real possibility that I'd spent the last several hours talking to myself in an empty basement. performing a ritual for people who existed only in my own exhausted mind. The chest looked ordinary now, just a piece of restored furniture waiting for its new owner. No longer singing, no longer demanding attention, no longer pulling my awareness toward depths I couldn't fathom. But when I ran my fingers over the symbols on its lid, I could still feel the faintest warmth beneath the wood. And when the workshop fell completely silent, when the ambient noise of the city faded and the building settled into perfect stillness, I thought I could hear something that might have been wind, or waves, or the distant sound of voices singing songs of homecoming in languages I'd never learned but would always remember. The phone rang, jarring me back to the present. A client, wondering about the progress on an antique desk I'd forgotten I was supposed to be working on. I told her it would be ready by the end of the week and hung up to get back to work. Normal work. Rational work. The kind that didn't require questioning whether the voices in your basement were real or just the sound of your own mind finding ways to cope with stories too terrible to process. But as I reached for my sanding block, I noticed something that made my hand freeze halfway to the tool rack. Footprints in the sawdust on the basement door threshold. Barefoot impressions that definitely hadn't been there yesterday, leading from the stairs to where I'd been standing. Footprints that weren't mine. I stared at them for a long moment, then deliberately swept the sawdust clean and went back to work, humming softly to myself to fill the silence. Story 3. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric requiem above me as I settled into another graveyard shift at Westfield Commons, though calling it that felt like a cruel joke. The mall had been gutted 18 months ago, stripped of everything that once made it alive. Now I patrolled empty storefronts and hollow corridors, watching over nothing more than dust and memories that belonged to other people. My name is Marcus, and I've been the night security guard here for 6 weeks. The job pays well enough to keep me from asking too many questions about why anyone would need security for a place that held nothing worth stealing. The management company's instructions were simple. Patrol every 2 hours, monitor the camera feeds, and report anything unusual. What they didn't mention was how the silence could crawl under your skin like a living thing. The security office sat in what used to be the mall's administrative center, a cramped room lined with monitors displaying feeds from cameras scattered throughout the building. Most showed the same thing night after night. Empty corridors bathed in the sickly glow of emergency lighting. Vacant storefronts with their metal gates pulled down like closed eyelids. The images flickered occasionally, probably from outdated equipment, but nothing that seemed worth mentioning in my reports. That changed on a Tuesday night in October. I was nursing my third cup of coffee when movement on monitor 7 caught my eye. The screen showed Corridor 9B, a service hallway that ran behind what used to be the food court. A figure moved across the frame, tall, wearing what looked like a hooded jacket or coat that obscured any identifying features. The person walked with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. My radio crackled to life as I reached for it. The dispatcher's voice seemed unusually distant when I reported the possible intruder. She told me to investigate but advised caution, reminding me that the building had multiple entry points that weren't always secure. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, leaving the monitors behind. Corridor 9B lay in the mall's northeastern section, accessible through a maintenance door behind the defunct Sparrow. The journey there took me through the main concourse, past shops that had been stripped bare, but still bore the ghostly outlines of their former signage. My footsteps echoed in the vast space, creating a rhythm that seemed to follow me rather than originate from my movement. When I reached the corridor, it was empty. I swept my flashlight beam across the narrow space, illuminating water-stained walls and a concrete floor marked by years of foot traffic. The air carried a musty smell, like old books mixed with something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. Nothing suggested anyone had been there recently. I was about to head back when I noticed something odd about the wall at the corridor's far end. What I had initially taken for a shadow appeared to be an alcove or doorway, though my flashlight couldn't penetrate its depths. I approached slowly, my shoes scuffing against the concrete with sounds that seemed too loud in the confined space. The alcove was deeper than it appeared, extending back into darkness that my light couldn't fully reach. More troubling was the feeling that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The building's blueprints, which I'd studied during my orientation, showed Corridor 9B ending at a solid wall. Yet here was clear evidence of space beyond that supposed barrier. I radioed in my findings, describing the discrepancy between the blueprints and what I was seeing. The dispatcher's response came after a longer pause than usual, her voice carrying an odd quality that I couldn't quite place. She suggested I had probably discovered an old utility access that wasn't included in the current building plans, nothing unusual for a structure that had been renovated multiple times over the years. Her explanation made sense, but it didn't address the growing unease I felt standing there. The darkness ahead seemed different from the ordinary absence of light, thicker somehow, as if it had substance. I decided to return to the security office rather than explore further. Back among the monitors, I immediately checked the feed from Corridor 9B. The screen showed the same empty hallway I had just left, but something felt wrong about the image. The perspective seemed slightly off, as if the camera had been moved a few degrees since my last viewing. I made a note to check the camera mountings during my next patrol. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but I found myself returning repeatedly to Monitor 7, watching for any sign of movement. The corridor remained static and empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, that the camera was somehow failing to capture what was really there. The next night brought a repeat performance. The same figure appeared on the monitor at almost exactly the same time, moving through Corridor 9B with that same purposeful stride. This time, I was ready, having positioned myself closer to the corridor before the appointed hour. I reached the scene within minutes of spotting the movement, but again found nothing except empty space and that troubling alcove that shouldn't exist. The pattern continued for the next several nights. The hooded figure would appear on the monitor. I would rush to investigate and I would find nothing. Each time, the image quality seemed to degrade slightly, as if the camera was aging in fast forward. Static began creeping into the feed, creating momentary distortions that made it difficult to discern details about the mysterious person. It was during my second week of these nightly encounters that the radio transmissions began. I had just returned from another fruitless chase when my radio erupted with voices that definitely weren't coming from our dispatch center. The signal was weak and shot through with static, but I could make out fragments of what sounded like emergency broadcasts. The voices carried the formal, clipped tones of professional radio announcers, though they used terminology and speaking patterns that seemed oddly dated. The clearest transmission I managed to record came through during my third week. Reports continued to come in regarding the mass disappearances at the Westfield Commons location. Officials are asking residents to avoid the area while emergency services conduct their search operations. The missing persons were last seen entering the building's lower levels, which appear to have been part of the original civil defense structure. The broadcast cut off abruptly, leaving only the normal static of an empty channel. I played back the recording several times, trying to parse its meaning. The reporter had mentioned Westfield Commons specifically, but referred to it as if the mall was still operational. More puzzling was the reference to missing persons and lower levels that didn't appear on any of the building plans I had access to. I decided to research the building's history during my off hours. What I discovered in the city planning office's archives explained much while raising even more disturbing questions. Westfield Commons had indeed been built on the foundation of a Cold War-era fallout shelter, constructed in the late 1950s and abandoned when the civil defense program was scaled back in the 1970s. The mall's construction in the early 1980s had incorporated some of the existing underground infrastructure, though the exact details were obscured by decades of bureaucratic record-keeping. More troubling were the newspaper clippings I found from 1973. A series of articles described a string of disappearances centered around the abandoned shelter site. 17 people had vanished over a period of 3 months, all last seen in the vicinity of what would eventually become the mall. The investigation had gone nowhere, with police reports describing the shelter as thoroughly searched and structurally sound. The disappearances stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind only questions and grieving families. Armed with this new knowledge, I approached my next shift with a mixture of dread and determination. The hooded figure appeared right on schedule, moving through Corridor 9B with what now seemed like familiar routine. But instead of immediately rushing to intercept them, I decided to observe more carefully, studying the monitor for details I might have missed. The figure moved differently than I had initially thought. Rather than walking through the corridor, they seemed to be guiding something or someone else, gesturing toward areas off camera with movements that suggested communication or instruction. Most unsettling was the realization that their path didn't follow the corridor's actual layout. They moved as if navigating a space larger and more complex than what I knew existed. This time, when I went to investigate, I brought additional equipment: a second flashlight, my smartphone with its camera and voice recorder activated, and a crude map I had sketched of the area. I also made sure to announce my movements over the radio, creating an audio record of my activities. Corridor 9B was empty as always, but the mysterious alcove seemed different. The darkness beyond appeared less absolute, and I thought I could detect the faintest suggestion of air movement, as if there were open space ahead. I approached the threshold slowly, my flashlight beam probing the shadows. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the building's layout. The alcove opened onto a much larger space, a room or corridor that extended well beyond the range of my light. The walls appeared to be constructed from older materials, rough concrete and exposed rebar that looked nothing like the mall's modern construction. The air carried a different smell too, earthier and more humid, with undertones that reminded me of old basements and forgotten places. I was about to step through the threshold when my radio erupted with another transmission, this one clearer than any previous broadcast. All personnel are advised that the lower evacuation routes remain active. Citizens reporting to the shelter should proceed directly to Assembly Point Charlie via the northeastern access tunnel. Do not attempt to use the main entrances, which have been compromised. Emergency services are standing by to assist with the relocation process. The voice had the authoritative tone of an official emergency broadcast, but its content made no sense in the context of an abandoned shopping mall. More disturbing was the timestamp that appeared on my radio's display. The transmission was supposedly being received from a frequency that hadn't been in use since the early 1970s. I backed away from the alcove, my unease now approaching outright fear. The space beyond that threshold felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, as if it existed in violation of basic principles of architecture and physics. Yet the radio transmission suggested that someone or something was treating it as an active emergency facility, directing people to locations that shouldn't exist. Over the following nights, the pattern intensified. The hooded figure appeared more frequently, sometimes multiple times per shift. The radio transmissions became more detailed and urgent, describing evacuation procedures and emergency protocols for a facility that had been abandoned for decades. Most troubling of all, I began to notice that the transmissions seemed to be responding to my presence, as if some invisible authority was aware of my investigations. The breaking point came during my 4th week on the job. I had just completed my routine patrol when every monitor in the security office simultaneously displayed the same image: Corridor 9B, but not as I knew it. The camera showed a bustling scene of people moving through the space with obvious urgency. They wore clothing from an earlier era, heavy coats and formal wear that looked distinctly 1970s in style. All of them moved toward the mysterious alcove, which appeared in the camera feed as a brightly lit tunnel entrance. But when I rushed to the actual corridor, I found it empty as always. The discrepancy between what the cameras showed and what my eyes could see had become absolute. I was witnessing 2 different realities occupying the same physical space, and I had no way to determine which one was real. The revelation that finally shattered my confidence came when I discovered something I had somehow missed during all my previous visits to Corridor 9B. Carved into the wall beside the alcove, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, were dozens of names and dates. All of the dates fell within that 3-month period in 1973, when the disappearances had occurred. All of the names matched those listed in the newspaper articles I had researched. But at the bottom of the list, carved in fresher-looking letters, was my own name followed by today's date. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands began to shake. The radio crackled to life one final time, the transmission clearer than ever. Security personnel Marcus Reynolds, please report to Assembly Point Charlie for immediate evacuation. The shelter protocols are now in full effect. Please proceed to the northeastern access tunnel without delay. I ran. I ran through empty corridors and past vacant storefronts, my footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces like gunshots. Behind me, I could hear other footsteps keeping pace, though when I looked back I saw nothing but darkness. The security office felt like sanctuary when I finally reached it, though even there the monitors showed things that couldn't be real. Crowds of people moving through corridors I knew to be empty, emergency lights flashing in spaces that had no power, the hooded figure standing in the doorway of the office itself, gesturing for me to follow. I've been sitting here for hours now, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. The radio continues its impossible broadcasts, describing an evacuation that ended 40 years ago, but somehow continues in the present. The monitors show a building full of people who aren't there, or perhaps I'm the one who isn't there, watching from some space between what was and what is. The thing that terrifies me most is not the supernatural impossibility of what I'm experiencing, but the growing certainty that it all makes perfect sense. The hooded figure isn't a ghost or hallucination. It's a guide, doing exactly what it was trained to do in 1973, when the shelter's emergency protocols were activated for reasons that were never recorded in any official documents. It's still doing its job, leading people to safety in a facility that was never officially closed because the emergency never officially ended. The question that haunts me as I write this report is simple. Am I witnessing the past bleeding through into the present, or have I somehow slipped backward into an event that never fully concluded? The people who disappeared in 1973, were they evacuated to safety in a shelter that exists outside normal time and space? Or are they still there, waiting in assembly points that exist in the margins between what is real and what is necessary? I don't know if anyone will read this report. I don't know if my radio calls are reaching a dispatcher in the present day or being recorded by emergency services that were disbanded decades ago. What I do know is that the hooded figure is standing behind me now, visible in the reflection on my monitor screen even though the camera shows an empty office. It's holding out its hand in a gesture that is unmistakably an invitation. The radio is speaking my name again, directing me to Assembly Point Charlie. The northeastern access tunnel is waiting. The emergency protocols are in full effect, and I am the only one left who hasn't reported for evacuation. Maybe it's time I stopped running from whatever this is and accepted that some emergencies don't end just because the calendar pages turn. Maybe the only way out of this nightmare is to follow the guide who has been trying to help me all along, to trust in procedures that were designed to save lives even when those lives exist in times and places that shouldn't be possible. I can hear them now, all of them. The voices of people who found their way to safety in a shelter that exists everywhere and nowhere, in a time that was and is and always will be 1973. They're calling my name, welcoming me home to a place I've never been, but somehow always known was waiting. The hooded figure is patient. It has been patient for 50 years. It will wait as long as necessary for me to understand that the evacuation isn't over, that it can never be over, that somewhere beneath the abandoned shopping mall, and the empty corridors, and the broken dreams of American commerce, the shelter protocols remain in effect, and the people who followed them remain safe. All I have to do is follow the guide. All I have to do is step through the threshold. All I have to do is report to Assembly Point Charlie, and join the evacuation that never ends, because the emergency that started it never truly began. The monitors are showing me the way. The radio is calling my name. The hooded figure is waiting. It's time to go home. Story 4. The cold had teeth that night. I'd been driving the same route through Santa Catarina's highlands for 12 years, hauling freight between Sao Paulo and Porto Alegre. But I'd never felt winter bite like this. The thermometer on my dashboard read -8 Celsius, and the wind outside howled with the voice of something hungry. My breath fogged the cabin despite the heater running full blast, and frost crept along the edges of my windshield like searching fingers. The smart thing would have been to push through to the next truck stop, but exhaustion weighed heavier than common sense. My eyes burned from staring at the endless ribbon of asphalt, and the caffeine pills I'd swallowed hours ago had worn off. leaving me jittery and hollow. When I spotted the familiar pull-off area, a small gravel lot carved into the mountainside where drivers sometimes caught a few hours of sleep, I knew I had to stop. I killed the engine, and silence crashed over me like a wave. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping world, but something deeper, more absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I tilted the seat back, pulled my jacket tighter, and closed my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. The cold seeped through the metal walls of my cab, and with it came something else, a presence that made the hair on my arms stand upright. When I opened my eyes an hour later, my windshield had transformed into a canvas of impossible art. Ice crystals covered the glass in intricate patterns that defied explanation. These weren't the random formations I'd seen countless times before, spiderwebs of frost spreading from the edges, or the delicate fern-like structures that bloomed overnight on winter windows. These symbols had purpose, intention. They formed lines and curves that mapped out roads, intersections, and landmarks with surgical precision. The frost had drawn me a route. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The patterns remained, clear as highway signs. The ice had traced a path that diverged from the main highway about 5 kilometers ahead, winding through side roads I'd never noticed before, leading to what looked like a dead end deep in the mountains. At the terminus of this frozen map, a circular symbol pulsed with an inner light that couldn't be explained by reflected moonbeams. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Condensation patterns, temperature differentials, the way streetlights might create optical illusions on frost-covered glass. But my gut knew better. This was something else entirely. I started the engine, and the heater's warm breath began erasing the edges of the ice map. Panic seized me as I watched hours of intricate work dissolving before my eyes. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and snapped photos, but the camera couldn't capture what I saw. The screen showed only ordinary frost patterns, meaningless and random. The smart thing would have been to drive away, get back on the highway, find the next truck stop, grab coffee and forget this ever happened. Instead, I put the truck in gear and headed for the main road, my eyes locked on the remaining portions of the ice route as they slowly melted away. 5 kilometers down the highway, exactly where the frost map indicated, I found the turnoff. A narrow paved road I'd somehow missed in 12 years of driving this route, marked by a sign so weathered I couldn't read it in the darkness. The pavement looked newer than it should have, as if it had been recently laid but artificially aged. I pulled over and consulted my GPS, but the device showed nothing. No road, no path, just empty mountain terrain where I could clearly see asphalt disappearing into the trees. That should have been my second warning to turn around. I steered onto the side road anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating pine trees that stood like silent sentinels on either side. The road curved and twisted with unnatural smoothness, as if it had been designed by someone who understood the mountain's secrets. My GPS continued to insist I was driving through solid rock and forest, the little arrow of my position floating in a void of digital confusion. 20 minutes into the journey, I noticed something wrong with my mirrors. The rear view showed the road behind me, but it wasn't the same road I'd just traveled. Ice covered the asphalt in sheets so thick they gleamed like black glass. Snow fell in the reflected world, though my windshield remained clear. And there, following about 100 meters behind, was my own truck, identical down to the rust spot on the passenger door and the crooked number on my license plate. I pressed the brake and watched my doppelganger's headlights approach. The mirror truck never slowed, never swerved, just continued its steady pursuit through the frozen landscape that existed only in the reflection. When I accelerated, it maintained the same distance, neither gaining nor falling behind. When I checked my side mirrors, they showed the same impossible scene, a winter wasteland where my phantom double navigated roads of ice. The strangest part wasn't the truck itself, but what was missing from it. The cab rode empty, no shadow of a driver visible through the windshield. My ghostly twin piloted itself through the mirror world's blizzard with mechanical precision, as if it knew exactly where it was going. I tried rolling down the window to get a different perspective, but the glass wouldn't budge. The handle turned freely, but the mechanism seemed frozen solid. When I checked the temperature gauge, it showed the cabin was a comfortable 22 degrees, yet my breath continued to fog, and ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows. The road curved sharply to the left, and I followed it around a steep mountainside. Below, the valley spread out like a black ocean, dotted with lights that didn't belong to any towns I knew. The settlements formed patterns too regular for random development. Perfect geometric shapes that pulsed with the same ethereal glow I'd seen in the frost map. When I blinked, the lights shifted positions, rearranging themselves into new configurations before settling back into their impossible symmetry. I reached for my radio to call for help, but static filled the airwaves. No familiar trucker chatter, no late-night radio shows, just white noise that almost sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The static grew louder as I continued along the route, occasionally resolving into what might have been words before dissolving back into electronic snow. The road began to descend, and the temperature dropped with each mile. Despite the truck's heater running at maximum, frost spread across my windshield from the inside, forcing me to peer through an ever-shrinking clear patch in the center. The defroster had no effect. If anything, the patterns grew more elaborate when I tried to clear them. New symbols appeared in the ice, geometric designs that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the road terminated at a massive concrete structure built into the mountainside. At first glance, it looked like a tunnel entrance, but something was fundamentally wrong with its proportions. The opening was too perfectly circular, too smooth, like a mouth that had been designed rather than carved. Rails emerged from the darkness within, not modern railroad tracks, but something older, constructed from metal that gleamed with an oily, rainbow sheen. A sign beside the entrance bore text in Portuguese, but the letters kept shifting whenever I tried to read them directly. From the corner of my eye, I could make out fragments, entrada proibida, and perigo, and other warnings that rearranged themselves into new combinations before I could comprehend their full meaning. Below the text, symbols matched those that had appeared in the frost on my windshield, spirals and angles that seemed to twist deeper into themselves the longer I stared. I parked the truck and climbed down from the cab, immediately regretting the decision. The cold outside wasn't just bitter, it was alive. It moved through my clothes like searching hands, finding every gap in my defenses and exploiting it. My lungs burned with each breath, and the air tasted of metal and something else, something organic and wrong. The tunnel mouth exhaled a wind that defied the laws of physics. Instead of the stale, musty air I'd expect from an abandoned railway, this breeze carried scents of pine forests and spring rain, impossibly fresh for a passage carved through solid rock. The contrast with the brutal winter surrounding me made no sense, but neither had anything else since I'd first seen the ice route. I approached the entrance, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls with too much resonance, as if the sound was being amplified and distorted by the tunnel's geometry. The railroad tracks extended into darkness so complete my flashlight couldn't penetrate it. They ran perfectly straight, disappearing into a void that seemed to swallow light itself. Behind me, I heard the familiar rumble of a diesel engine and turned to see my truck driving away. Not being driven, driving itself. The headlights swept across the trees as it navigated the curves with inhuman precision, heading back toward the main highway without a driver's hand on the wheel. I ran after it, shouting into the wind, but the vehicle moved with steady determination, leaving me stranded beside the tunnel entrance. My mirror world double had somehow crossed over. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal bars and something else that made my blood freeze. The time displayed read 3:33 a.m., but according to my internal clock, I'd been driving for less than an hour since leaving the pull-off. Either my phone was malfunctioning, or I'd lost several hours somewhere along the ice route. Worse still, when I checked my photo gallery for the pictures I'd taken of the frost map, I found something that shouldn't exist. The images were there, but they didn't show my windshield. They showed the tunnel entrance, taken from exactly where I now stood, as if I'd photographed this place hours before I'd arrived. In the pictures, A figure stood silhouetted in the tunnel mouth, tall, motionless, watching the camera with patient intensity. I looked up at the actual entrance, but it remained empty, filled only with that impossible darkness and the scent of distant spring. The wind picked up, carrying voices that might have been my imagination. They spoke my name with perfect pronunciation, though I'd never heard these particular tones before. Male and female voices, young and old, all calling me toward the tunnel with gentle insistence. When I closed my eyes, I could almost make out words of comfort, promises of warmth and rest, and answers to questions I'd never known to ask. I took a step toward the entrance and felt the temperature rise noticeably. Another step, and my breath stopped fogging. The brutal cold that had been gnawing at my bones since I'd left the truck began to retreat, replaced by the mild warmth of a perfect spring evening. The scent of pine and rain grew stronger, accompanied by new fragrances: wildflowers, fresh bread, coffee brewing somewhere in the distance. The voices grew clearer as I approached, resolving into conversations that sounded like family gatherings, holiday dinners, old friends sharing stories by a fireplace. They painted pictures of comfort and belonging that made my isolated life on the highway seem unbearably lonely. All I had to do was keep walking into the tunnel, and I could join them. I was 10 feet from the entrance when headlights swept across the mountainside behind me. My truck had returned, engine rumbling with familiar authority. It sat where I'd parked it, exhaust visible in the frigid air, as if it had never left. The driver's door hung open, and warm light spilled from the cab onto the frozen ground. The voices in the tunnel grew urgent, no longer inviting, but demanding. The spring warmth turned aggressive, pulling at my clothes and hair with invisible hands. The scent of flowers became cloying, too sweet, tinged with something rotten underneath. I ran for the truck and threw myself behind the wheel, slamming the door and hitting the gas before I could think. The engine roared, and we shot away from the tunnel entrance like a cork from a bottle. In my rearview mirror, I saw the darkness flowing out of the opening like liquid shadow, reaching for my departing taillights with tendrils of impossible geometry. The drive back to the main highway passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror. The mirror world version of the road showed normal asphalt now. No ice, no phantom truck. Just ordinary reflections of ordinary trees. My GPS flickered back to life as I reached the turnoff, immediately announcing my position and offering directions to the nearest truck stop. I didn't stop driving until I reached Sao Paulo 12 hours later, pushing through exhaustion and paranoia with chemical assistance and sheer willpower. At the depot, I filed my delivery report and submitted a request for a different route, citing mechanical problems with my GPS system. 3 weeks later, I drove past that section of highway again, on a different assignment I couldn't avoid. It was midday, bright and warm, with spring approaching and the snow long since melted. I slowed down near the 5-kilometer mark, looking for the turnoff that had led me to the tunnel. There was no side road, no weathered sign, no mysterious pavement disappearing into the trees, just dense forest and the kind of terrain that would be impossible to navigate with any vehicle, let alone an 18-wheeler. According to every map I consulted, nothing had ever been built in that area. No railroad, no tunnel, no roads of any kind. But when I got home that night and checked the photos on my phone, I found new images I hadn't taken. Dozens of them, all showing the same tunnel entrance from different angles and distances. In every picture, the figure in the opening had moved closer to the camera. In the last photo, it was close enough that I could see its face. It was mine. Story 5. The static always came first. I'd been running KCST 104.7 for 3 years, broadcasting from the cramped studio above Murphy's Hardware on Main Street. The equipment was older than my father's fishing boat, held together with electrical tape and the kind of stubborn pride that keeps small-town radio alive. But it worked. Most nights. The phantom signal started appearing during my equipment tests, those lonely 3 a.m. sessions when I'd run diagnostics and prep for the morning show. At first, I thought it was atmospheric interference. The coast played hell with radio waves, especially during the winter storms that rolled in from the Pacific like prehistoric beasts. But this was different, cleaner, more deliberate. It came through on 107.3 FM, a frequency that should have been dead air. No station had broadcast from that dial position since the old lighthouse operation went dark in 1961. I'd researched the history during one of my insomnia-fueled nights. Point Sorrow Light had operated its own emergency frequency until the fire consumed everything: transmitter, beacon, and the lighthouse keeper who'd locked himself inside during the blaze. The official report blamed faulty wiring. The locals whispered about other things. The first time I heard my own voice coming through that dead frequency, I assumed someone was playing a recording. Technical glitches happened. Maybe some old broadcast had bounced around the ionosphere and found its way home, like a message in a bottle washing ashore decades later. But as I listened, ice forming in my veins, I realized the voice wasn't reading from any script I'd ever written. The phantom me was reporting news that hadn't happened yet. I'd been describing a 3-car accident on Highway 1, just south of the Brennan Curve, when my hands began trembling so violently I had to grip the desk to steady myself. The voice coming through my headphones was mine. Every inflection, every pause, even the way I cleared my throat before difficult segments. But I was reporting details I couldn't possibly know. The make and model of the vehicles, the exact time of impact, even the name of the tow truck driver who would respond. The accident happened 48 hours later, exactly as the phantom broadcast had described. I started keeping a log, documenting every transmission. They came irregularly, sometimes multiple nights in a row, sometimes not for weeks. Always my voice, always events that materialized within days of the broadcast. A fishing boat lost in fog, found exactly where the phantom me said it would be. A power outage that left the south end of town dark for 6 hours. A minor landslide that blocked the old coast road. The accuracy was absolute, unsettling, impossible. Sleep became elusive. During the day, I'd catch myself listening for echoes of my own voice in conversations, wondering if the words leaving my mouth had already been spoken by my phantom counterpart. I started avoiding mirrors, disturbed by the possibility that my reflection might be delivering news I hadn't yet learned. Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner market, mentioned that I looked tired. Her grandson Tony, home from college, said I seemed jumpy. Even Father Martinez, during his weekly station visit, asked if I was feeling well. Their concern felt genuine, but I couldn't shake the sensation that they were studying me, watching for signs of something they already knew was coming. The breakthrough, if that's what you could call it, came during a late October storm. I was testing equipment when the 107.3 signal cut through the static with unusual clarity. This time the phantom broadcast was longer, more detailed. The other me was reporting on a windstorm approaching from the northwest, describing sustained winds of 65 miles per hour and gusts reaching 90. I found myself unconsciously mimicking the delivery, my lips moving along with words I'd never spoken. But here's what broke my understanding of reality. As the phantom broadcast continued, describing the storm's projected path and intensity, every phone in the station began ringing simultaneously. Listeners were calling to report an immediate, inexplicable drop in temperature. Not gradual cooling, but sudden sharp cold that cut through heated rooms and made breath visible in air that had been warm moments before. The storm the phantom me was describing wouldn't arrive for 3 days. Yet somehow, its presence was already being felt. I answered call after call, each more disturbing than the last. Sarah Dunmore said the temperature in her kitchen had dropped 20 degrees in seconds, despite her heating system running at full capacity. Bob Riley reported that frost had suddenly formed on his windows, on the inside. Margaret Walsh claimed she could smell ozone and salt spray in her living room, though she lived 2 miles inland. The phantom transmission was somehow creating the conditions it described. That night, I broke protocol and drove to Point Sorrow. The lighthouse had stood empty since the fire, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out over the dark Pacific. But as I approached the rusted gate that blocked the access road, I could see light emanating from the top of the tower, not the steady beam of an operational lighthouse, but an erratic, flickering glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The temperature around the lighthouse was at least 15 degrees colder than the rest of the town. My breath formed clouds that lingered longer than they should have, as if the air itself was somehow thicker, more resistant to the laws of physics. The sound of waves against the rocks below seemed amplified, each crash echoing with unnatural clarity. I sat in my truck for an hour, engine running, heater blasting, watching that impossible light dance in the tower window. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was stress, sleep deprivation, some kind of breakdown brought on by isolation and responsibility. But rationality felt thin here, inadequate to explain the weight of presence I felt pressing against the truck windows. When I finally returned to the station, I found a recording device on my desk that I didn't remember leaving there. The digital display showed 12 minutes and 37 seconds of recorded material. I hadn't been gone that long. I hadn't left any recording equipment running. I played the file. It was my voice, describing a massive storm system that would devastate the coast in 72 hours. But this broadcast was different from the others. This time, the phantom me was transmitting from inside the lighthouse, and I could hear something else in the background, a sound like breathing or wind moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. At the very end of the recording, just before it cut to static, there was something that made my skin crawl. The phantom me seemed to be responding to someone else, someone whose voice was just below the threshold of clarity, someone who sounded exactly like me. The storm arrived precisely as predicted, sustained winds of 67 miles per hour, gusts reaching 93, power lines down throughout the county. The coast road washed out in 3 places. But here's what the weather service couldn't explain. The storm seemed to intensify as it passed directly over Point Sorrow, as if the lighthouse itself was feeding energy into the system. I filed my reports like any good broadcaster would, but my voice felt hollow, disconnected from my body. I was describing events that I'd already heard myself describe, creating a loop of reporting that made my head spin with vertigo. Reality was becoming recursive, folding in on itself until I couldn't distinguish between what I was experiencing and what I was remembering myself experience. The calls started again during my live broadcast, but this time, the listeners weren't reporting temperature drops or strange atmospheric effects. They were asking me to repeat information I hadn't given them, details about the storm's aftermath that I was apparently providing, though I had no memory of speaking those words. Mrs. Chen called to thank me for the warning about the power lines on Cedar Street, but I hadn't mentioned Cedar Street. Tony contacted the station to confirm the time the coast road would reopen, a time I'd never announced. Father Martinez wanted clarification about the shelter locations I'd supposedly provided, shelters I'd never heard of. I was broadcasting information I wasn't consciously delivering. That's when I understood. The phantom signal wasn't just predicting the future, it was creating it, using my voice as a conduit to shape reality through broadcast. Every word the phantom me spoke was programming events into existence. And somehow, I was unconsciously transmitting those same words during my regular shows, completing a circuit of causality that bent the world to match the predictions. But the most terrifying realization came when I checked the station logs. According to the automatic recording system, I'd been broadcasting continuously for the past 3 days, even during the hours when I was certain I'd been away from the studio, even during the hour I'd spent at Point Sorrow, watching that impossible light. The recordings showed my voice, steady and professional, delivering weather updates and emergency information throughout periods when I had no memory of being in the building. The timestamps were accurate. The content matched the phantom transmissions exactly. Either I was losing time, blacking out while some unconscious part of me continued broadcasting, or something else was using my voice and my signal to reshape reality, according to a script I couldn't read. I knew I had to reach the lighthouse, the source of the signal. The phantom me had mentioned transmitting from inside the tower, and somehow I understood that breaking the connection required confronting whatever waited there. One final broadcast to sever the link between prediction and creation, between the voice that spoke futures into existence and the man who was losing himself to echoes of his own words. As I write this, The 107.3 signal is growing stronger. I can hear my phantom self preparing for another transmission, describing events that won't happen for days, but are somehow already casting shadows across the present. The temperature in the studio has dropped 12 degrees in the past hour, and I can smell salt spray, though the windows are closed, and we're 3 blocks from the ocean. The lighthouse is calling, its broken beacon pulsing with the rhythm of words not yet spoken. I understand now that I've always been heading there, following a script written in broadcasts I've never made but somehow remember delivering. The phantom signal isn't predicting my future. It's been broadcasting it all along, and I've been nothing more than an echo of events already determined. In 30 minutes, I'll drive to Point Sorrow. I'll climb the lighthouse stairs to the transmitter room where reality bends like radio waves around a broken tower. I'll deliver one final broadcast, though I already know every word I'll speak, because I've heard myself speak them through the static of a frequency that should be dead. The only question that remains is whether the voice that emerges from the lighthouse will still be mine, or if I'll finally meet the phantom broadcaster who's been using my signal all along, the one who sounds exactly like me, but speaks words I've never chosen to say. The transmission is about to begin. The future is calling, and it knows my name. Story 6. The first thing you notice about the subterranean archive isn't the musty smell of old paper or the way fluorescent lights flicker against concrete walls. It's the silence, too complete, too heavy, like the air itself has been pressed thin and wrung dry. I've worked as head archivist at Westfield University for 7 years, but I'd never ventured this deep beneath the humanities building until Dr. Carver mentioned the overflow collection in passing, almost reluctantly, during our quarterly budget meeting. The elevator descended past floors I didn't know existed, its cables groaning like old bones. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a corridor that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of the overhead lights. The air moved differently down here, not quite still, but restless, as if it couldn't decide which direction to flow. The archive room itself was larger than I'd expected, filled with metal shelving units that disappeared into shadows. But it wasn't the size that stopped me cold. It was the books. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all identical in their abnormality. No covers, no spines, just raw binding that looked almost organic in the dim light. They sat in perfect rows, their pages slightly splayed, as if someone had just been reading every single one. I approached the nearest shelf with the clinical detachment I'd cultivated over years of handling rare manuscripts. The books felt warm under my fingertips, their pages soft and yielding like skin. As I lifted one from its place, a gentle draft stirred through the room, just enough to ruffle my hair and set the fluorescent lights swaying on their chains. The book fell open in my hands. The page turning began immediately, as if invisible fingers were guiding each sheet. The soft whisper of paper against paper filled the silence, but underneath that sound, I heard something else. Voices. Male voices, distant and indistinct, like a conversation overheard through water. I told myself it was the ventilation system, or perhaps the building settling, but the rational explanations felt thin and unconvincing even as I formed them. I leaned closer to the open pages, trying to make sense of the text. The writing was clear enough. English, handwritten in a cramped but legible script. But the content made my skin crawl. It was a detailed account of a hurricane that had never happened, describing the complete devastation of coastal Louisiana in language so vivid I could taste the salt spray and feel the wind's fury against my face. The narrator wrote as if he'd witnessed it firsthand, documenting wind speeds, storm surge heights, and casualty figures with meteorological precision. But there had been no such hurricane. I would have remembered. The pages continued turning themselves, revealing more impossible disasters, tornadoes that carved through the Midwest with unprecedented ferocity, droughts that turned the Great Plains into moonscapes, floods that swallowed entire cities. Each account was written in a different hand, but the voices beneath the page-turning remained constant, a chorus of men describing catastrophes that existed nowhere in recorded history. I snapped the book shut. The silence that followed was absolute, not just quiet. Absent. The voices stopped. The ventilation system fell silent. Even the electrical hum of the lights disappeared. More disturbing still, I realized I couldn't hear my own breathing, couldn't detect the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. The world had become a vacuum, and I was floating in its center, utterly alone. The sensation lasted perhaps 10 seconds before sound rushed back in a disorienting wave. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the book, my hands trembling as I replaced it on the shelf. The whispered voices resumed immediately, rising from every direction now, as if the entire archive had awakened to my presence. I should have left then. Any reasonable person would have sealed the door behind them and never spoken of what they'd found. But archivists aren't reasonable people. We're drawn to mysteries like moths to flame, even when the light promises to burn us. Over the following weeks, I returned to the underground archive daily. I told my colleagues I was conducting a routine inventory of the overflow collection, cataloging materials that had been overlooked in previous assessments. The lie came easily, perhaps too easily, and I began to notice how naturally deception had crept into my daily interactions. Each visit revealed new horrors within the book's pages, climate disasters of impossible scope and scale, described with the intimate detail of eyewitness accounts. The voices beneath the page-turning grew more distinct with each exposure, and I began to identify individual speakers within the collective whisper. There was the man with the slight southern accent who documented the great ice storms, the Midwesterner who specialized in tornado systems, the coastal dweller who chronicled the rising seas. They all spoke as if these events had already happened, as if they were recording history rather than prophecy. But the dates they referenced were wrong. Some placed decades in the future, others described last Tuesday with events that had never occurred. The disconnect between their certainty and my reality began to eat at the edges of my sanity. I started keeping detailed notes, trying to establish patterns in the accounts. Were they random catastrophes, or was there some organizing principle I was missing? The writing became an obsession, filling notebook after notebook with cross-references and timelines that led nowhere. My apartment grew cluttered with weather maps and climate data as I searched for connections to the real world, for any thread that might anchor these impossible narratives to observable truth. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake listening to the wind outside my bedroom window, wondering if it carried messages I couldn't decode. During rainstorms, I found myself straining to hear voices within the drumming of water against glass. The boundary between the archive's whispered voices and the natural world grew increasingly porous. My colleagues began to notice changes in my behavior. Dr. Carver cornered me in the faculty lounge one afternoon, her eyes bright with concern as she asked about my health. I assured her I was fine, just tired from the inventory work, but her skepticism was evident. She suggested I take some time off, maybe see the campus counselor, and I agreed with the hollow enthusiasm of someone who had already traveled too far down a dark path to consider turning back. The breakthrough came during my third week of daily visits. I was examining a particularly disturbing account of simultaneous volcanic eruptions across the Pacific Ring of Fire when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The handwriting, which I'd assumed belonged to yet another unknown chronicler, was familiar. Not just familiar, it was mine. My own cramped script, slightly slanted to the right, with the distinctive way I crossed my T's and looped my G's. I was reading my own handwriting describing events I had no memory of witnessing. The book trembled in my hands as I read my own account of ash-darkened skies and pyroclastic flows, written with the same obsessive detail as all the others. But when had I written this? The memory was completely absent, as if someone had reached into my mind and plucked out specific experiences while leaving everything else intact. I began searching frantically through other volumes, looking for more examples of my own handwriting. I found them scattered throughout the collection, dozens of accounts in my own hand, describing disasters I couldn't remember experiencing. The voices beneath the page-turning seemed to intensify as I made these discoveries, their whispered words becoming almost comprehensible. They were trying to tell me something. The revelation came not as a sudden flash of understanding, but as a slow-growing horror that crept through my consciousness like frost spreading across glass. The wind wasn't just turning the pages, It was the language itself. The moving air was how these accounts communicated, how they shared their knowledge across time and space. And somehow, impossibly, I had become part of that communication. But if I was writing these accounts, when was I living these experiences? And if these disasters hadn't happened in my timeline, in what version of reality had I witnessed them? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. Was I documenting events from parallel worlds? Or were these glimpses of futures that hadn't yet crystallized? Were the voices I heard the collected consciousness of climate witnesses across multiple realities, and had I somehow been inducted into their ranks? I began to notice that the wind patterns in the archive corresponded to the intensity of the voices. When the air was perfectly still, the whispers faded to barely audible murmurs. But when drafts stirred through the room, and they seemed to occur with increasing frequency during my visits, the voices rose in urgent crescendo, as if trying to convey critical information before the air settled once again. The most disturbing realization came when I noticed that the weather outside began to mirror the patterns in the archive. On days when I encountered accounts of severe thunderstorms in the books, real storms would develop by evening. When the voices spoke of unseasonable temperature drops, the next morning would bring an unexpected cold front. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to dismiss as paranoid pattern seeking. I was no longer just reading about disasters. I was somehow helping to forecast them, or perhaps even willing them into existence. The thought that my presence in the archive might be influencing real-world weather patterns should have driven me away permanently. Instead, it drew me deeper into the mystery. If I could understand the mechanism, perhaps I could control it. Maybe I could prevent the disasters rather than simply documenting them. But each attempt to close a book before finishing its account resulted in the same terrifying silence, the same complete absence of sound that left me floating in a sensory void. And when hearing returned, the voices always seemed more agitated, more urgent, as if my interruption had somehow disrupted a crucial process. I began to suspect that reading the accounts wasn't optional, that once I'd opened a book, I was obligated to witness its contents through to completion. The alternative was that terrible silence, and each exposure to the void lasted longer than the last. During my most recent attempt to close a book mid-account, the silence stretched for nearly a minute, leaving me gasping and disoriented when sound finally returned. The fear that one day the silence might become permanent began to dominate my thoughts. What if the next time I closed a book prematurely, I never heard anything again? What if the void claimed me completely, leaving me trapped in a world without sound, without the whispered voices that had become my only companions in this increasingly isolated existence? Tonight, I sit in my apartment with the latest notebook spread before me, trying to make sense of everything I've discovered. The wind outside has been constant for hours, rattling windows and setting tree branches into frantic motion. It sounds almost like language now, like the collective whisper of the archive voices trying to communicate something urgent. Tomorrow's weather forecast calls for clear skies and calm conditions, but I no longer trust conventional meteorology. The voices have been growing more insistent, their whispered accounts more immediate and pressing. They speak now of a storm approaching this very region, not in some distant future or alternate timeline, but within days. The accounts describe it with the same terrifying precision as all the others. Wind speeds exceeding anything in local records, rainfall totals that will overwhelm every drainage system, flood patterns that will reshape the entire valley. And I've found my own handwriting among these newest accounts, documenting the storm's approach with the clinical detachment of someone who has already witnessed its devastation. The wind outside is growing stronger, and I can hear the voices more clearly now, even without the books open before me. They're calling to me, welcoming me back to the archive, urging me to complete the readings I've left unfinished. They promise answers to questions I haven't yet learned to ask, explanations for phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of rational thought. I know I should resist their call. I should pack my belongings and leave this place before whatever's coming arrives. But the voices have become part of me now, and I part of them. We are chroniclers of impossible weather, witnesses to climate catastrophes that exist in the spaces between what was and what might be. The storm they describe is almost here. I can feel it building in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pauses between thoughts. And when it arrives, I'll be ready to document its passage with the same meticulous care as all the others who came before me. After all, someone has to keep the record of what never happened. Someone has to listen to the wind and translate its whispered warnings for those who come after. The books are waiting for me in the archive below. The voices are calling me home, and I think I'm finally ready to answer. Story 7. The ground-penetrating radar shouldn't have detected anything that deep. Not here, not in these pristine dunes that stretched endlessly along Brazil's northeastern coast like sleeping giants beneath the relentless sun. But the screen didn't lie. 15 feet down, a perfect rectangular void gaped in the data like a missing tooth in an otherwise solid jaw of compressed sand. I'd been contracted to map the coastal erosion patterns, nothing more. A routine geological survey to help the Environmental Ministry understand how these ancient formations shifted with each season's winds. Simple work for a man who'd spent 20 years reading the Earth's secrets through electromagnetic pulses and core samples. Yet as I stared at that anomalous reading on my laptop screen, sweat beating despite the ocean breeze, I felt the familiar tug of curiosity that had led me into more than one professional rabbit hole. The excavation began at dawn. My small crew, 2 local university students eager for field experience, worked methodically, their shovels biting into sand that grew darker and more compact with each layer. By noon, we'd reached the depth where my instruments insisted something waited. The sand here felt different beneath my fingers, almost crystalline, as if it had been fused by intense heat sometime in the distant past. Then Miguel's shovel struck wood. The sound was wrong, too hollow, too deliberate for driftwood or natural debris. As we carefully brushed away centuries of accumulated sand, rough-hewn planks emerged, fitted together with a craftsmanship that spoke of desperate purpose rather than careful construction. The wood was dark, almost black, preserved by some quirk of chemistry and compression that I couldn't immediately explain, but it was what lay beneath the planks that made my hands shake as I photographed each artifact in situ. Military equipment, certainly, but nothing I recognized from any conflict I'd studied. The metal was corroded beyond easy identification, yet certain shapes remained unmistakable. The curve of a breastplate, the elongated form of a blade, objects that seemed to belong to an age when warfare was personal and brutal. Most disturbing were the boots, a dozen pairs, arranged in perfect formation, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and marched away. The students exchanged glances heavy with superstition as we cataloged each find. They spoke in hushed Portuguese about soldados fantasmas and crossed themselves when they thought I wasn't looking. I dismissed their unease as cultural mythology bleeding into scientific observation, but I couldn't ignore how the temperature seemed to drop several degrees whenever we lingered too long near the excavation. As evening approached and my crew departed for the nearby village, I remained alone with my discovery. Standard protocol demanded I contact the archaeological authorities before proceeding further, but something about the site felt urgently personal, as if disturbing it now would sever some tenuous connection I was only beginning to understand. I pitched my tent 50 yards from the excavation, close enough to monitor for looters, but far enough to avoid the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the exposed wooden structure. The ocean's rhythm should have been soothing, but tonight each wave sounded like a marching cadence, measured and inevitable. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of men in antiquated armor trudging through endless sand. I woke repeatedly to check my watch, finding only minutes had passed since I'd last looked. The darkness beyond my tent felt alive with waiting presence, and more than once I found myself straining to hear sounds that existed just below the threshold of perception. At 3:47 a.m., I gave up pretending to sleep and emerged from my tent to check the site. The boot prints surrounding my camp made no logical sense. They were fresh, impossibly fresh, pressed deep into sand that should have shown some sign of filling or wind erosion. But more than that, they belonged to no modern footwear. The impressions were too wide, too deep, made by boots with thick leather soles and reinforced heels. Military boots, but from an era when warfare required men to march vast distances on foot. I followed the trail with my flashlight, hands trembling slightly as the beam illuminated print after perfect print in a formation that spoke of rigid discipline. The tracks led directly to my excavation, circled at once with geometric precision, then simply stopped, as if an entire unit had materialized, inspected their buried cache, and vanished back into whatever realm had claimed them. Standing at the edge of my excavation, flashlight beam dancing across the exposed planks, I heard it clearly for the first time. Voices. Distant but unmistakably human, speaking in rapid Spanish that my limited knowledge of the language couldn't parse. The sound seemed to emerge from the wooden structure itself, as if the planks were some kind of amplifier for conversations taking place in a different time entirely. I told myself it was wind through the exposed timber, acoustics playing tricks in the pre-dawn stillness. But as I strained to listen, certain words became clear enough to understand. Cruz, arena, marchar, cross, sand, march. The next morning brought Miguel and Elena back to the site, their excitement about the previous day's discoveries dimmed by my haggard appearance. When I showed them the boot prints, Elena crossed herself and suggested we contact the local church. Miguel was more pragmatic but equally disturbed. He'd grown up in these dunes and insisted no one could have approached without leaving vehicle tracks or other signs of passage. We worked in relative silence, carefully excavating more of the wooden structure. It appeared to be some kind of makeshift fortification or storage bunker, built with the rough efficiency of men who expected to need protection but didn't plan to stay long. As we cleared the last of the sand from what appeared to be a sealed compartment, I felt a familiar tingle of anticipation mixed with dread. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived centuries of burial, we found the documents. The Spanish was archaic, written in a formal hand that spoke of military training and desperate urgency. Even with my rudimentary understanding of the language, certain phrases stood out with crystalline clarity. The papers detailed the final march of a colonial unit, the Compañía de la Cruz Sagrada, that had become separated from the main expedition somewhere along this very coastline. But it was the final entry that made my blood run cold. According to the document, dated sometime in the early 17th century, the unit had been following a luminous cross that appeared each night on the horizon. The phenomenon had led them deeper into the coastal dunes, away from any known settlements or water sources. The final entry, written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic, described how the cross had begun calling to them directly, not with words, but with a compulsion that felt like divine command. "We march into the sand tonight," the final lines read in my halting translation. "The cross demands witness. We will not be forgotten. Our testimony will be given when the earth reveals us to one who can understand." The document was signed by Captain Alejandro Vasquez, but the signature looked fresh, as if the ink had dried only hours before. That evening, I sent Miguel and Elena back to town earlier than usual. Their nervousness had been growing throughout the day, and I couldn't blame them. The site felt different now that we'd found the documents, more alive, more aware. The very air seemed to pulse with expectation, as if invisible observers were evaluating my every move. I spent the afternoon photographing every page of the Spanish documents, uploading digital copies to my cloud storage with an urgency I couldn't quite explain. Some instinct warned me that physical evidence at this site had a way of becoming unreliable, subject to forces that respected neither scientific method nor linear time. As darkness fell, I made a decision that violated every principle of archaeological prudence I'd ever learned. Instead of securing the site and waiting for proper authorities, I descended into the excavation with my camping lantern and began systematically exploring the wooden structure. The cramped space below felt like stepping into a living museum, where the boundary between past and present had worn dangerously thin. Personal effects lay scattered in arrangements that suggested hasty preparation for departure. Rosaries tangled with military insignia, water containers still bearing traces of their long evaporated contents, and everywhere the smell of old leather and metal oxidation mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling that I couldn't identify. But it was the final chamber that broke whatever rational framework I'd been clinging to. Here, arranged in perfect military formation, were the personal effects of what appeared to be an entire company of soldiers. Helmets sat atop folded uniforms that retained their shape, as if invisible men still wore them. Weapons lay precisely spaced, their metal surfaces showing no rust despite centuries of burial. And in the center, a wooden cross that glowed with its own soft, phosphorescent light. I should have fled. Every instinct screamed that I'd uncovered something that transcended normal archaeological discovery, something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that kept rational minds intact. But as I stood transfixed by that impossible luminescence, I felt a presence settling around me like a familiar embrace. They wanted their story told, not through official channels or academic papers, but through witness testimony from someone who could bridge the gap between their lost century and this modern age. The realization came without words, transmitted through the same inexplicable compulsion that had once drawn Spanish soldiers into endless sand. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty chamber, describing everything I'd discovered in precise detail, as if delivering a formal report. My voice echoed strangely in the confined space, seeming to carry farther than the wooden walls should have allowed. With each word, the phosphorescent glow of the cross grew brighter, and I became increasingly certain that somewhere in the space between past and present, Captain Alejandro Vasquez was finally receiving the testimony his unit had waited 4 centuries to give. When I emerged from the excavation hours later, dawn was breaking over the dunes. My digital voice recorder, which I didn't remember activating, contained 6 hours of detailed testimony about every artifact, every document, every impossible detail of my discovery. But when I played it back, my voice seemed to overlap with others, distant but unmistakable Spanish voices providing additional details, confirming dates, adding context that no amount of research could have provided. The boot prints around my tent had multiplied overnight. Now they formed complex patterns that looked almost like ceremonial formations, as if an entire spectral company had conducted some kind of formal military ceremony while I'd been underground. In the center of the patterns, someone had arranged the sand into the shape of a cross, not the religious symbol I'd expected, but the precise outline of the phosphorescent artifact I'd found in the buried chamber. As I broke camp that morning, preparing to return to civilization with evidence that would challenge everything I thought I knew about time, memory, and the persistence of human will, I found one final addition to my documentation. Tucked into my equipment bag, written on paper that felt impossibly old, yet somehow fresh, was a letter in perfect English that began, "Dr. Matthews, thank you for your testimony. The Compañía de la Cruz Sagrada can finally rest, knowing our march into the sand has been witnessed and recorded. We trust you will understand why certain evidence must remain ambiguous. History belongs to those who survive to tell it, but some stories require believers rather than scholars." The letter was signed Captain A. Vasquez in the same archaic hand I'd seen on the Spanish documents. Driving away from the dunes 3 days later, my official report filed and my physical evidence cataloged in appropriate academic channels, I found myself questioning every assumption I'd once held about the nature of reality. The Archaeological Review Board would debate the significance of my discoveries for months, but they would never find the phosphorescent cross or the perfectly preserved military equipment. The excavation site, when revisited by the official team, contained only the wooden planks and a few corroded metal fragments consistent with routine shipwreck debris. But the voice recordings remained, and the letter stayed folded in my wallet like a talisman against rationality. Some nights, when sleep proves elusive and the boundary between memory and dream grows thin, I find myself walking phantom beaches where Spanish soldiers march in eternal formation toward horizons that exist only in the spaces between seconds. They nod as I pass, acknowledging the bond between witness and witnessed, between those who experience the impossible and those who find the courage to testify. I never return to those dunes, though I'm told the wind has already filled in my excavation site. The sand keeps its secrets well, revealing them only to those prepared to accept that some stories transcend the comfortable limitations of scientific explanation. The Compañía de la Cruz Sagrada marched into the sand 4 centuries ago, following a light that promised meaning in endless wandering. They found their witness eventually, someone willing to bridge the gap between their lost time and our mapped world. Whether they've finally found rest, or whether they continue their eternal march through dimensions I can't begin to understand, remains a question I'm no longer certain I want answered. Some testimonies, once given, change the witness as much as the witnessed. The cross still glows in my dreams, and sometimes I wake to find sand in my shoes that tastes of salt and ancient purpose. Story 8. Where the rope felt wrong in my hands. 37 years I'd been restoring church bells, from the grand cathedrals of Boston to the modest chapels scattered across New England's forgotten towns. I knew the weight of hemp and manila, the proper tension of a well-hung clapper, the sweet resonance that spoke of bronze cast with reverence and skill. But this rope felt like touching something that had been buried and shouldn't have been disturbed. I'd come to Pedra Santa, a mining town tucked into the Brazilian highlands, to restore the bells of Igreja do Sacramento. The local priest, Father Mendoza, had contacted my firm through a colleague in São Paulo. The church dated to 1742, he explained, and its 2 bronze bells had fallen silent after decades of neglect. Simple enough work, or so I thought. The campanile rose 40 feet above the nave, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Pigeons nested in the corners, their droppings layered thick as sediment. The 2 documented bells hung exactly where I expected, magnificent pieces cast in Lisbon, their bronze still singing true despite the corrosion. But wedged behind them, almost hidden in the shadows of the tower's eastern wall, hung a 3rd bell. No documentation mentioned it. Father Mendoza seemed genuinely surprised when I asked about it, claiming he'd never noticed it during his 15 years at the parish. The thing was roughly the same size as its companions, perhaps 200 pounds of bronze, but completely unlike them in every other way. Where the Lisbon bells bore elaborate inscriptions praising God and identifying their makers, this one was blank. Not worn smooth, blank, as if it had never been inscribed at all. Its surface held a peculiar matte finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The rope that connected to its clapper was wrong too. While the other bells used proper hemp, this one hung from what looked like braided human hair, dark, coarse strands woven tight and blackened with age. When I touched it, my fingertips tingled with an electric sensation that left them numb for several minutes. I should have left it alone. The restoration of the documented bells proceeded smoothly. I spent 3 days cleaning their bronze, replacing their rigging, and testing their mechanisms. They sang beautifully, clear, rich tones that carried across the red-tiled roofs of Pedra Santa and echoed off the surrounding hills. Father Mendoza seemed pleased, speaking warmly of how the bells would again call his congregation to worship. But the 3rd bell nagged at me. Its presence made no sense. Church bells weren't hidden things. They were instruments of proclamation, meant to be seen and heard. Why would this one be concealed? And why did I find myself thinking about it during my meals, during my evening walks through the cobbled streets, during the sleepless hours before dawn when the mining town lay wrapped in humid silence? On my 4th night in Pedra Santa, I couldn't stand it anymore. I returned to the church near midnight, letting myself in with the key Father Mendoza had provided. The nave felt different in darkness, larger somehow, its colonial architecture shifting in the shadows cast by my flashlight. Religious art that looked benign in daylight now seemed to watch me with eyes that tracked my movement toward the campanile stairs. The climb felt longer than usual. Each step echoed strangely, as if the sound were being duplicated somewhere below me in the darkness. By the time I reached the bell chamber, sweat was running down my back despite the cool night air. The 3rd bell hung motionless in the moonlight that filtered through the tower's arched openings. I approached it slowly, fighting an irrational urge to turn around and leave. This close, I could see that its bronze surface wasn't merely unpolished. It was actually textured, covered in tiny indentations that formed no pattern I could recognize. When I played my flashlight across them, they almost seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I reached for the hair rope, intending to ring the bell just once, to hear what voice it might have. The moment my fingers closed around the braided strands, the world changed. The bell rang without my pulling it. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the clear bronze voice of a proper bell, but something deeper and more complex. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating not just through the air but through my bones, my skull, the very foundations of the church below. And with that sound came something else. A sudden absence where presence should have been. My shadow vanished. I spun around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the campanile walls, but cast no shadow anywhere. The light fell on surfaces and simply stopped, as if the part of me that should have blocked it had ceased to exist. I held up my hand directly in front of the beam. Nothing. No outline, no silhouette, no proof that I occupied any space at all. The bell continued ringing, though I'd released the rope immediately. 30 seconds passed, like 30 minutes before the sound finally faded, and my shadow reappeared, pooling around my feet as if it had never been gone. I stumbled down the spiral stairs and out of the church without looking back. The next morning, I told myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the oppressive humidity. But when I approached the local cafe for breakfast, conversation stopped. People stared at me with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked like recognition, though I'd barely interacted with any of them during my stay. The elderly woman who served my coffee leaned close as she set down the cup. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You heard it too, didn't you? 3:33, just like always." I checked my watch. The bell had rung at exactly 3:33 a.m. I spent that day in the town's small library, searching through historical records and parish documents. Most were in Portuguese, which I read haltingly, but I found references to the church's construction and early years. The Igreja do Sacramento had been built under the direction of one Father Joaquim Borges, a Jesuit missionary who'd arrived in the region in 1740. The records described him as a zealous man, obsessed with purifying the spiritual atmosphere of the mining town. According to a letter dated 1743, Father Borges had become convinced that spiritual darkness lingered in the very foundations of his church, drawn by the violence and greed of the mining operations. He'd commissioned a special bell from a foundryman in Minas Gerais, not to call the faithful to worship, but to contain and silence the whispers of shadow. The letter's final paragraph made my hands tremble as I read it. "The good Father has succeeded in his task, though at great cost. The darkness is bound within the bronze, and so it shall remain as long as the bell stays silent. May God forgive us for what we have done, and may future generations be wise enough never to wake what sleeps." That night I lay in my hotel room staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the town settling into sleep. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind through the shutters, seemed to carry something else. Voices speaking in a language I almost recognized. Latin words drifted up from somewhere below, chanted in rhythm but too faint to understand. At 3:32 a.m., I was already awake when the bell began to ring. This time I was nowhere near the church, but I could hear it clearly. That deep, bone-deep resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Through my hotel window, I watched the entire town lose its shadows. Street lamps illuminated empty air where darkness should have pooled. The few people visible on the streets cast no silhouettes, moving like ghosts through a world temporarily drained of depth. And in that 30-second void, I heard them clearly. Voices rising from beneath the church, speaking Latin words in harmonies that hurt to listen to. They spoke of binding and loosing, of imprisonment and freedom, of hunger that had been growing for centuries. When the shadows returned, silence fell like a curtain. I should have left Pedra Santa the next morning. My work was finished. The documented bells rang true and clear, but something kept me there, a compulsion I couldn't name. I found myself returning to the church during daylight hours, climbing to the campanile to stare at the third bell. Each time it seemed slightly different, its surface more textured, its rope darker, its presence more insistent. Father Mendoza began to avoid me. When we did speak, his eyes held a nervous quality that hadn't been there before. He asked repeatedly when I planned to leave, mentioning several times that the restoration was complete and my presence was no longer required. But the town's other residents seemed drawn to me now. They would approach on the street, speaking in hushed Portuguese about dreams they'd been having, about shadows that moved independently of their owners, about voices calling from beneath their houses. I didn't understand all the words, but their fear was universal. On my 8th night in Pedra Santa, I made a decision that still haunts me. I would ring the bell intentionally, at a time of my choosing, rather than its own. Perhaps if I controlled the moment, I could understand what was happening. Perhaps I could break whatever cycle had been set in motion. I entered the church at 11 p.m., 3 hours before the bell's usual sounding. The nave felt different again, not just darker, but compressed somehow, as if the walls were slowly closing in. The colonial saints seemed to watch my progress with increasing urgency, their painted eyes tracking me as I moved toward the stairs. The climb to the campanile took forever. Each step echoed with multiplying reverberations, as if countless feet were climbing invisible stairs in parallel with mine. By the time I reached the bell chamber, the air itself felt thick and resistant, like moving through water. The third bell hung waiting, its bronze surface now clearly writhing with patterns that formed and dissolved like living shadows. The hair rope had grown longer. I was certain of it, hanging lower than before and swaying slightly despite the absence of any wind. I approached slowly, flashlight beam dancing across the walls where my shadow should have been but wasn't. Even before I touched the rope, I was already casting no reflection of light. The bell's influence was expanding. When I grasped the braided hair, the voices began immediately. No longer faint whispers from below, but clear, urgent speech rising from somewhere directly beneath my feet. Latin words I almost understood, speaking of imprisonment and release, of bindings that weakened with each ringing, of hunger that had been contained but never satisfied. I pulled the rope. The bell rang once, its impossible voice filling not just the campanile, but the entire world. And in that sound, I finally understood what Father Borges had done in 1743. He hadn't banished the spiritual darkness that plagued his church. He had trapped it, bound it within bronze and silence, starved it for nearly 3 centuries. But the binding was weakening. Each ring fed the darkness, gave it strength, brought it closer to freedom. And it was hungry, not for light or shadow or any physical thing, but for something else. Something it sensed in me, standing there in the campanile at the exact moment of its feeding. It wanted a host, a way back into the world, someone willing to carry it down from the bell tower and out into the town below. The bell's voice finally faded, but the darkness remained. It filled the campanile now, visible as more than mere absence of light, a presence that moved and coiled and reached toward me with tendrils that might have been shadow or smoke or something else entirely. I ran. I stumbled down the spiral stairs, hearing my footsteps echoed by dozens of others, feeling the darkness following like a tide. I burst from the church into the pre-dawn streets and kept running until I reached my hotel, where I packed my bags with shaking hands and called for the first taxi to take me to the airport. But I didn't escape. Not really. Even now, 6 months later, I hear the bell. Not just at 3:33 a.m., though that's when it's strongest, but throughout the day. Faint bronze voices calling from empty rooms, from shadows that move wrong, from dreams that feel more real than waking life. I've tried returning to my normal work, but every church bell I restore speaks with an echo of that other voice, that hungry resonance that wants something I'm not sure I'm strong enough to refuse. And sometimes, in mirrors or windows or pools of still water, I catch glimpses of Pedra Santa's campanile, the third bell hanging there, waiting, its bronze surface crawling with patterns that look almost like writing, almost like messages, almost like promises. I tell myself it was just stress, altitude sickness, a series of coincidences magnified by an overactive imagination. I tell myself that bells don't ring themselves, that shadows don't disappear, that voices don't rise from beneath centuries-old foundations. But I also know that somewhere in the highlands of Brazil, a mining town loses its shadows every night at 3:33 a.m. And I know that with each ringing, something grows stronger, hungrier, more desperate to find its way out of the bronze prison where it's been contained for nearly 300 years. What I don't know, what I wake up wondering every morning as sunlight fills my bedroom and temporarily chases away the whispers, is whether I'm the one who's going to let it out, or whether I already have. Story 9. The elevator climb to the 14th floor felt longer than usual, each floor marker blinking past with deliberate slowness. I'd shown hundreds of properties in my 12 years as a realtor, but something about this particular listing made my stomach tighten with each ascending number. Maybe it was the way the previous 3 potential buyers had fled during their walkthrough, muttering excuses about bad vibes and feeling dizzy. Or maybe it was the building's management company calling me directly, practically begging me to find a tenant for 14B. The hallway stretched before me, carpeted in that institutional beige that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being pulled away from me and played back a split second later. The door to 14B stood at the far end, unremarkable except for the way it seemed to lean slightly inward, as though the frame itself was tired. I inserted the key, and the moment the lock clicked open, my phone buzzed against my leg. The screen showed 14:12. I frowned, checking my watch. It read 2:47 p.m. Electronics malfunction, probably interference from the building's old wiring. I made a mental note to mention it to potential clients as a charming quirk of vintage construction. The door swung open with a soft whisper, revealing an apartment that shouldn't have felt as vast as it did. The living room extended beyond what the floor plan suggested, shadows pooling in corners that seemed too deep for the available space. Afternoon sunlight slanted through windows that faced west, but the light felt muted, as if it was traveling through water before reaching the room. I stepped inside, my shoes clicking against hardwood that gleamed with an almost wet sheen despite appearing bone dry. The sound of my entrance seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, creating an echo that didn't quite match the room's dimensions. I pulled out my phone to start taking photos for the listing, and froze. 14:12. I checked my watch again. Still 2:47 p.m. The phone's time hadn't changed, hadn't even advanced a minute despite several minutes having passed since I'd entered the building. I restarted the device, waiting for the familiar startup sequence. When it finished loading, the time displayed 14:12 once more. A soft sound drifted from deeper in the apartment, the unmistakable squeak of wet footsteps on tile. Slow, deliberate steps that suggested someone walking carefully across a slippery surface. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice seemed to dissolve into the strange acoustics of the place. The stepping sounds continued, unhurried and methodical. I moved toward the source, passing through a kitchen where the appliances hummed with an almost organic rhythm. The refrigerator's motor seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, while the microwave's digital display flickered between numbers that didn't quite resolve into recognizable time formats. The stepping sounds grew clearer as I approached what I assumed was the bathroom. The door stood ajar, revealing white tile that gleamed under fluorescent lighting. I pushed it open fully and found myself staring at a space that defied logical explanation. The bathroom was pristine, every surface dry as bone, yet the sound of dripping water echoed from invisible sources. Wet footprints marked the floor in a pattern that suggested someone had been pacing in tight circles, but the prints themselves were barely visible, more like shadows of moisture than actual watermarks. Every surface in the bathroom was covered with writing, not carved or painted, but etched into the tile itself as if the ceramic had been soft when the words were pressed into it. The text covered every available inch, walls, floor, even the ceiling above the bathtub. All of it seemed to revolve around the same central theme. Time finds anchor points. The moment refuses passage. 2:12 p.m., November 15th, first successful suspension. Death is release. Suspension is captivity. The apartment remembers the experiment. I pulled out my phone to photograph the inscriptions, but the device showed the same frozen time, 14:12. The camera function worked, but when I tried to review the images, they appeared corrupted. showing only gray static with faint outlines that might have been text. The stepping sounds had stopped. I backed out of the bathroom, suddenly aware that the apartment felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted inward while I'd been reading. The living room seemed compressed, the windows narrower than before. My breathing quickened, and I noticed that each exhale seemed to hang visible in the air slightly longer than it should have, like breath on a cold day despite the apartment's warmth. In the main bedroom, I discovered more evidence of the previous tenant's obsession. A desk sat against one wall, its surface scarred with deep gouges that formed equations and diagrams. Mathematical formulas sprawled across every inch, all focused on concepts I didn't recognize. Temporal anchor points, moment suspension theory, chronological displacement. A notebook lay open, its pages covered in handwriting that became increasingly erratic as it progressed. The final entry, dated November 15th, consisted of a single line repeated dozens of times. The experiment worked. The experiment worked. The experiment worked. Below that, in what looked like a different pen, someone had written, "But I can't leave." My phone buzzed. Still 14:12. I checked my watch, tapping its face to ensure it was working. The second hand moved normally, but when I looked at my phone again, the time remained frozen. I tried calling my office, but the call wouldn't connect. The signal bars showed full strength, but every attempt to reach the outside world failed with the same error message. Call cannot be completed at this time. The apartment's silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water pressure. No traffic sounds filtered up from the street below. No neighbor noises bled through the walls. Even my own movement seemed muffled, as if the air itself was thickening around me. I walked to the windows and looked out at the city below. Everything was still. Cars sat motionless on the streets. Pedestrians stood frozen mid-stride on sidewalks. A bird hung suspended in the sky, its wings spread but unmoving. The scene looked like a photograph, beautiful and terrible in its perfect stillness. I pressed my face against the glass, breath fogging the surface, and watched as the condensation appeared and remained, not fading as it should have. When I stepped back, the fog didn't dissipate. It clung to the window like a permanent stain, forming patterns that looked almost like letters, like words trying to form themselves from the moisture. My heart hammered against my ribs, but even that familiar rhythm felt wrong. The beats seemed to stretch out, each pulse lasting longer than the last, as if my cardiovascular system was being forced to match the apartment's temporal distortion. I could feel my movements becoming more deliberate, each step requiring more conscious effort than the last. The inscriptions in the bathroom began to make a horrible kind of sense. Someone had been experimenting with time, with the possibility of suspending moments, freezing them like insects in amber, and they'd succeeded, but the success had become a trap. The apartment wasn't just affected by the experiment, it was the experiment, a pocket of suspended time that captured everything that entered it. I rushed to the front door, but my run felt like wading through invisible molasses. Each step took tremendous effort, and the distance to the exit seemed to stretch as I moved toward it. The door handle felt ice cold under my palm, and when I tried to turn it, the mechanism moved with agonizing slowness. The hallway beyond looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, but something fundamental had changed. The carpet's color seemed more saturated, the lighting more intense. Other apartment doors lined the corridor, but they appeared somehow flatter, like props in a stage set rather than actual entrances. I called the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly. The indicator above the doors remained dark, and no mechanical sounds suggested the car was moving. I tried the stairwell, but the door was locked, its handle refusing to budge despite multiple attempts. Every exit route had been sealed, not by physical barriers, but by the apartment's expanding influence. Back inside 14B, I noticed that the shadows had grown longer despite the unchanging light outside. My phone still showed 14:12, but now the display flickered occasionally, as if the device was struggling to maintain even that frozen moment. I tried taking more photos, desperate to document what was happening, but the images appeared increasingly distorted, showing rooms that looked nothing like the spaces I was actually seeing. The wet footsteps returned, circling through the apartment now instead of remaining confined to the bathroom. I followed the sounds, but they always seemed to stay just ahead of me, leading me in patterns that made no geometric sense. The living room connected to the kitchen, which led to the bedroom, which somehow opened back into the living room without any hallways or transitional spaces. Time was becoming elastic, stretching and contracting around me. Minutes felt like hours, but when I tried to count seconds, I lost track after 12. The number 12 kept returning, appearing everywhere. 12 tiles across the bathroom wall, 12 panes in each window, 12 repetitions of the phrase, "The experiment worked," in the notebook. 2:12 p.m., 14:12 in military time. November 15th could be written as 11:15, which added up to 12 plus 3, or 15 total. But 15 was also 3 times 5, and 5 plus 7 was 12. The numbers spiraled through my consciousness like a mathematical virus, connecting in patterns that felt significant, but remained just beyond my understanding. I found myself moving differently now, my gestures becoming as deliberate as everything else in the apartment. When I reached for door handles, my hand moved with careful precision. When I walked, each step was placed with methodical accuracy. The apartment was teaching me its rhythm, forcing me to match its temporal signature. The inscriptions on the bathroom walls had changed, or perhaps I was finally able to read them correctly. New text appeared between the lines I'd noticed earlier, written in the same etched style but somehow newer, as if the tiles themselves were generating fresh warnings. Visitors become residents. Exit requires temporal signature match. The moment expands to contain all subsequent moments. You are becoming part of the experiment. That last line appeared as I watched, letters pressing themselves into the ceramic surface with deliberate slowness. The apartment was communicating with me, or perhaps I was finally learning its language. The boundary between myself and the space around me was dissolving, my thoughts beginning to echo the mathematical obsessions carved into every surface. I understood now why the previous tenant couldn't leave. The apartment didn't just trap time, it trapped consciousness within that suspended moment. Every person who entered became another variable in the equation, another anchor point preventing the temporal suspension from collapsing. The more people it contained, the stronger its hold became. My watch had stopped. The hands pointed to 2:12, but they no longer moved. My heartbeat had synchronized with some deeper rhythm, a pulse that seemed to come from the apartment's walls themselves. When I tried to run toward the door, my movements matched the pace of everything else in the space. Deliberate, measured, eternal. The notebook on the desk now contained additional entries, written in handwriting that looked increasingly like my own. Equations that I somehow understood despite never studying temporal physics. Diagrams that made perfect sense even though they described impossible geometries. The final entry, in script that was definitely mine despite my having no memory of writing it, consisted of a single line. The next tenant will strengthen the anchor. Outside the windows, the frozen city waited. Cars remained motionless on streets that no longer led anywhere. Pedestrians stood like statues in a museum dedicated to the final instant before 2:13 p.m. on November 15th. And somewhere below, another realtor was probably receiving a call about a difficult property that needed showing, an apartment where previous clients had experienced strange malfunctions with their phones. My phone buzzed one final time before the screen went completely dark. In the reflection, I could see my face, but it looked somehow more symmetrical than I remembered, more precise, as if I was becoming a more perfect version of myself. The apartment was improving me, making me into exactly what it needed, another permanent resident of the moment between 1412 and eternity. I checked my watch out of habit, knowing what I would find. The hands pointed to 2:12, frozen in place like everything else. But now I understood that this wasn't a malfunction or a breakdown. This was exactly what was supposed to happen. The apartment had been waiting for me, just as it would wait for whoever came next. The wet footsteps began again, but now I recognized them as my own future movements, echoing backward through the suspended time. I would pace those same circles in the bathroom, adding my own inscriptions to the walls, calculating new variables for the equation that kept us all anchored in this perfect, terrible moment. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator was climbing toward the 14th floor, carrying another realtor with a difficult listing, and a phone that was about to start displaying 1412. The apartment hummed with patient anticipation, ready to expand its collection, ready to add another voice to the chorus of those who had discovered that some experiments succeed too well to ever be stopped. I took out my pen and began writing in the notebook, adding my observations to the accumulated research. The mathematics were becoming clearer now, the temporal mechanics revealing themselves as elegant and inescapable. Each new resident strengthened the anchor, made the suspension more stable, more permanent. And in that permanence, I was beginning to find a strange kind of peace. Story 10. The mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud that morning, thick enough to muffle sound and distort distance. I'd been running the scenic route for 7 years, knew every bolt and whistle of the old steam engine, every twist of track that wound through these ancient peaks. But as I walked the length of the train for my pre-departure inspection, counting cars as I always did, the numbers didn't add up. There should have been 5 passenger cars trailing behind the locomotive. I counted 6. The extra car sat wedged between the second and third coaches, as if it had materialized overnight from the fog itself. Its burgundy paint was weathered to the color of dried blood, and brass fixtures had tarnished to a sickly green. Most unsettling was how seamlessly it fit. The couplings showed no signs of recent attachment, no fresh scratches or disturbed grease. It looked as though it had always been there. I checked my manifest 3 times. 5 cars scheduled, 5 cars listed, but 6 cars present. The fog seemed to press closer as I circled the mysterious addition, my footsteps echoing strangely in the muffled air. Through the windows, I glimpsed dust-covered seats arranged in an old-fashioned configuration I didn't recognize. The station master, Henderson, was nowhere to be found when I tried to raise him on the radio. Static answered my calls, broken occasionally by what sounded like distant voices speaking in urgent tones, though I couldn't make out the words. The passengers, 23 tourists eager for their mountain excursion, waited in the station, checking their watches and peering into the fog with growing impatience. I should have delayed the departure, should have investigated further, contacted the main office, demanded explanations. Instead, something compelled me forward, a pull I couldn't explain or resist. The locomotive seemed almost eager as I fired up the boiler, steam pressure building with unusual enthusiasm. The familiar controls felt different under my hands, more responsive, as if the engine had developed its own intentions. As we pulled away from the station, I caught a glimpse of the mysterious car's interior through the rear-view mirror mounted for safety checks. The seats were indeed covered in dust, thick enough to show no footprints despite the morning's fog condensing on every surface. But what made my hands tighten on the throttle were the newspapers scattered across the floor and folded neatly on several seats. Even from that distance, even through the mirror's distortion, I could make out the headlines. Bold letters proclaimed disaster, tragedy, lives lost on these very tracks. The date visible on one paper's corner read, 1932. The train gained momentum as we climbed the first grade, wheels finding their rhythm on rails that sang a tune I'd never heard before. Usually the route's early section provided a gentle warm-up, but today the locomotive pulled with aggressive determination, as if driven by a schedule I hadn't set. During our first brief stop at Miller's Point, a scenic overlook where passengers usually disembarked for photos, I made my way to the mysterious car. The door handle was cold enough to burn, metal so frigid it seemed to draw heat from my palm. Inside, the air tasted of decades-old tobacco and something else, something metallic and sharp. The newspapers lay exactly as I'd glimpsed them in the mirror. Picking up the nearest copy, I felt the paper crumble slightly at my touch, edges brown with age. The headline read, "Mountain Scenic Railway Disaster Claims 17 Lives." Below it, a subheading declared, "Locomotive plunges from Devil's Curve in morning fog." Devil's Curve. I knew that section of track, a sharp turn around a granite outcropping about 2 hours into our route. The engineering surveys from when I'd started this job had mentioned it as one of the most challenging points on the line, requiring reduced speed and careful attention. But there had never been any accident there, never been any disaster. I read further, hands trembling despite the car's stifling warmth. The article described how a tourist train, much like ours, had attempted the curve at excessive speed during a morning shrouded in fog. The locomotive had jumped the rails, tumbling down the mountainside in a cascade of twisted metal and screaming steam. But according to my training materials, the line had been built in 1987. These newspapers predated the railway's existence by more than 50 years. I set the paper down carefully, trying to convince myself this was some elaborate prank or historical exhibit that had been misplaced. But as I moved to leave, I noticed something that made my breath catch. In the dust on the nearest seat, there was an impression, not footprints. I would have expected those, but the outline of a body, as if someone had sat there recently enough to disturb the accumulated grime. The train's whistle blew sharply, though I hadn't touched the cord. Through the car's windows, I could see we were already moving again, pulling away from Miller's Point with none of the gentle acceleration I'd commanded. The locomotive was running its own schedule now. Returning to the engine cab, I found the throttle lever pushed forward to a position I hadn't set. The pressure gauge showed readings higher than I maintained, and the speedometer indicated we were approaching the upper limits of safe operation for this section of track. When I tried to reduce power, the lever resisted, as if held by invisible hands. The radio crackled with that same strange static, but now I could almost make out words within the white noise. Fragments of conversation that sounded like coordination between an engineer and conductor, professional exchanges about speed and signals, and approaching curves. But the voices used terminology I didn't recognize, procedures that weren't part of modern railway operation. As we climbed higher into the mountains, fog rolling in thick walls across our path, I became increasingly aware that something was wrong with the car arrangement. During my routine check through the rearview mirror, I noticed the mysterious car was no longer in its original position between the second and third coaches. It now trailed at the very end of the train, despite the impossibility of such a rearrangement without uncoupling and extensive maneuvering. 20 minutes later, it had somehow moved to the front, directly behind the locomotive. I could see its weathered roof through the cab's side window, close enough to touch if I leaned out. The coupling between engine and car showed the same weathered condition as the rest of the mysterious addition, suggesting years of connection despite its recent appearance. My hands shook as I reached for the emergency brake. The locomotive's behavior was beyond any mechanical malfunction I'd encountered, beyond any rational explanation. But when I pulled the brake handle, nothing happened. The train continued its determined climb, speed increasing rather than decreasing, as if my inputs were merely suggestions it chose to ignore. The fog grew thicker as we approached the section I'd begun to dread. Devil's Curve lay ahead, though I'd never thought of it by that name before today. Now the designation seemed carved into my mind, as inevitable as the rails beneath our wheels. The newspapers in the mysterious car had provided detailed descriptions of the turn's geography, warning signs I'd never noticed during previous runs. Through the fog, landmarks began to appear exactly as the 1932 articles had described them. A lightning-struck pine tree, split and blackened, standing sentinel on the curve's outer edge. A granite outcropping shaped like a sleeping giant's profile. A wooden mile marker that shouldn't exist on a modern railway line, but which emerged from the mist exactly where the newspaper had placed it. The locomotive's whistle began sounding on its own, a series of sharp blasts that matched no standard signal I knew. Through the rearview mirror, I could see passengers in the regular cars looking concerned, faces pressed to windows as they tried to understand our increasingly erratic behavior. But when I glanced toward the mysterious car, its windows remained empty, dust-covered seats undisturbed despite our rough passage. The radio's static resolved briefly into clear transmission, voices from 1932 discussing weather conditions and track status with growing urgency. An engineer reporting fog so thick he could barely see the rails ahead. A conductor noting unusual locomotive behavior. Throttle responses that seemed independent of operator input. A dispatcher warning about speed restrictions approaching Devil's Curve. I realized I was hearing the final communications from the train that had never crashed, the disaster that had never happened. Somehow, Through mechanisms I couldn't comprehend, I was being forced to complete their interrupted journey. The curve appeared ahead through the fog, rails bending sharply around the granite outcropping just as the newspapers had described. The locomotive showed no sign of slowing, pressure gauges redlining, wheels screaming against rails that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. In the rearview mirror, the mysterious car had returned to its original position, and through its dust-covered windows, I could swear I saw shadowy figures occupying those ancient seats. The speedometer needle pushed past every safe limit as we approached the turn. I fought the controls, pulled emergency systems, even considered jumping from the cab despite the certain injury such action would cause. Nothing responded. The locomotive had become something beyond mechanical, driven by momentum that predated its construction. Devil's Curve rushed toward us through the fog, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was about to complete a disaster that had been waiting 93 years to happen. The newspapers hadn't been reporting history. They'd been predicting it, waiting for the right morning, the right fog, the right train to fulfill their headlines. But as we entered the curve, wheels shrieking against rails that seemed to bend and flex beneath our weight, something unexpected happened. Instead of the violent derailment the newspapers promised, we simply continued. The locomotive held the rails, maintained its impossible speed, and emerged from the curve intact. In the sudden silence that followed, I found myself alone in the cab of a familiar engine, running a routine morning excursion with 5 passenger cars, exactly as scheduled. The mysterious 6th car had vanished, leaving no trace of its presence beyond my own shaken memory and the lingering smell of aged tobacco. The radio crackled back to life with Henderson's voice, asking about our progress and mentioning nothing unusual about our departure. The passengers resumed their cheerful chatter, pointing out scenic vistas as if nothing had disturbed their journey. Even the fog began to lift, revealing the familiar mountain landscape I'd navigated hundreds of times before. But as we descended toward our final destination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Not in the world around me, but in my understanding of what was possible. The newspapers I'd seen, the voices I'd heard, the car that had moved through positions like a chess piece guided by invisible hands, all of it felt more real than the ordinary morning that surrounded me now. Later, during my mandatory post-trip inspection, I found myself counting cars again. 5, as always. 5, as scheduled. But in the dust beside the tracks, near where the mysterious car had first appeared, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. Tire marks from railway wheels, fresh impressions in the gravel, showing the distinctive pattern of a car that had been coupled and uncoupled recently. The spacing matched exactly what I remembered of the mysterious car's wheelbase. I never reported what happened that morning. Who would believe such a story? But I've continued running the route, and every time we approach Devil's Curve, I reduce speed regardless of schedule constraints. The fog still rolls through those mountains, thick and concealing, and sometimes when it's particularly dense, I catch glimpses of burgundy paint through the mist. The newspapers from 1932 predicted a disaster that never happened, but I've begun to suspect they weren't wrong, just early. Somewhere in the space between what was and what might be, a train is still running toward that curve, carrying passengers who don't exist toward a destination that waits in the fog. And someday, when the conditions are exactly right, when the mist is thick enough and the locomotive eager enough, that train might finally complete its interrupted journey. The only question is whether I'll be the one driving it when it does. Story 11. The smell hit me first, not the expected chlorine or fish tank staleness, but something deeper. Salt and seaweed, yes, but underneath that, the metallic tang of old copper and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my throat close up and my stomach twist. I stood in the lobby of the Marisol Farm Hotel, staring at what should have been a simple consultation job. The aquarium dominated the space, a massive cylinder that rose from floor to ceiling, maybe 12 feet in diameter. But it was the water that stopped me cold. It moved in a perfect spiral, a lazy helix that defied every principle of fluid dynamics I knew. No pumps hummed, no filters gurgled, yet the water maintained its rotation with mechanical precision. I approached slowly, my veterinary bag suddenly feeling heavier than it should. "Dr. Martinez?" The hotel manager appeared beside me, a thin man with nervous hands that wouldn't stay still. "Thank you for coming. I'm Robert Chen. We've been having concerns about the display." I nodded, still watching the water. "What kind of concerns?" His hands fluttered toward the tank, then dropped. "The spiral started 3 days ago. Maintenance checked everything. No equipment malfunction, no external causes they could find. But that's not the real problem." "What is?" Chen glanced around the empty lobby, then leaned closer. "Guests have been complaining about sounds. Singing, they say. Old songs. Some claim they see things in the water that aren't there." I set my bag down and pulled out my tablet, switching on the recording app. Standard procedure for unusual marine behavior cases. "How long has the tank been operational?" 6 months. We commissioned it as a centerpiece attraction. The contractor used reclaimed materials for authenticity. Panels from an old merchant vessel that sank off the coast in 1899. The Cantadora, I think it was called. The name sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. I moved closer to the glass, pressing my palm against its surface. The water felt warm, warmer than any properly maintained aquarium should be. And there was something else. A subtle vibration, like a distant engine running. What marine life was originally housed here? Small tropical fish, some coral formations. Standard reef setup, but... Chen's voice trailed off. "But what?" "They all died within the first week. Every fish, every piece of coral. The water chemistry was perfect, temperature controlled, everything by the book. They just stopped moving, one by one." I knelt beside the tank, examining the base where the old ship panels had been integrated. The wood was dark, almost black, with a grain pattern that seemed to shimmer in the lobby lighting. My fingers traced the edge where wood met glass, and I felt that vibration again, stronger now. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with something, my heartbeat maybe, or something deeper. "Dr. Martinez?" Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at the panel for several minutes. "Fine. Just examining the construction." I stood, feeling slightly dizzy. "I'll need to take some water samples, check the chemistry, maybe run some acoustic tests." "Acoustic tests?" "For the sounds your guests are hearing. Could be equipment resonance, pipe vibration, any number of things." I was saying the words, but part of me didn't believe them. The spiral continued its hypnotic rotation, and I found myself following its movement despite trying to focus elsewhere. That night, I researched the Cantadora in my hotel room 3 floors above the lobby. The internet connection was frustratingly slow, but I pieced together fragments of the story. The ship had been carrying exotic cargo from the Caribbean, rare corals, tropical fish, specimens for wealthy collectors in Boston. But there were stranger mentions buried in historical society records and maritime disaster reports. Multiple witnesses described hearing singing from the ship's hold during its final voyage. Passengers complained of sleeplessness, of dreams where they were swimming in endless oceans. The captain's final log entry, recovered from floating debris, mentioned that the ship's cargo had begun calling to the deep waters. The official cause of sinking was listed as structural failure, but survivor accounts spoke of the ship simply dissolving into the sea, as if the water had claimed it piece by piece. Only 23 of the 74 passengers and crew were rescued. I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, but the sound from below kept reaching me. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, but gradually resolved into something that might have been voices, distant voices, singing in harmony. I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to convince myself it was the hotel's ventilation system or maybe guests in the lobby bar. But the melody was too complex, too layered. Multiple voices weaving together in patterns that seemed almost familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. I found myself humming along before I realized what I was doing. The next morning, I returned to the lobby with a full array of testing equipment. The aquarium looked different in daylight, larger somehow, and the spiral seemed to have tightened. Where yesterday the water had moved in a lazy helix, now it formed a more pronounced vortex, though still gentle enough that watching it wouldn't immediately cause vertigo. I set up my underwater camera first, lowering it into the warm water. The monitor showed what I expected: empty space, glass walls, the wooden panels at the base. But as I adjusted the angle to examine the panels more closely, something made me pause the recording. There, reflected in the glass, was the shadow of a sail. I raised my head from the monitor and looked directly into the tank. Nothing but water and the wooden base. Back to the monitor. Still there. A triangular shadow moving slowly across the bottom of the frame. I adjusted the camera angle, and the shadow moved with it, always staying just at the edge of the image. Optical illusion, I muttered, but my hands were shaking as I continued the recording. The water samples told me nothing useful. pH balanced, salinity appropriate for marine life, no toxins or unusual bacteria. The acoustic sensors I'd placed around the tank registered the humming I'd heard, but the frequency analysis showed something impossible. The sound was coming from below the tank, from somewhere beneath the hotel's foundation. I spent the afternoon in the hotel's basement, examining the building's structure around the aquarium's base. The tank extended down into the foundation, deeper than the architectural plans indicated. When I asked Chen about it, his nervous hands became even more agitated. The contractor said they needed to go deeper than planned, he explained. Something about proper support for the weight. They hit some kind of underground water source and had to adjust the design. What kind of water source? I don't know. They sealed it off, used it as part of the tank's circulation system, said it would create a more natural environment. That evening, I positioned myself in the lobby after the hotel had emptied of guests. I wanted to observe the aquarium without interruption, to document any changes in the water's behavior. The singing had grown stronger throughout the day, and now, in the quiet lobby, it was impossible to ignore. The voices were definitely human, though the language was unfamiliar. Sometimes Spanish, sometimes English, sometimes something older. I could make out individual words. Home, mother, deep water, come down. Always an invitation, always gentle. As I watched, the spiral began to expand. Not physically, the tank remained the same size, but somehow the rotation seemed to encompass more than just the water inside the glass. The air around the tank started to shimmer, and I felt a pulling sensation, as if I were standing at the edge of a whirlpool. I approached the glass again, drawn by an impulse I couldn't name. My reflection looked strange in the curved surface, distorted and wavering. But behind my reflection, I saw others. Faces in old-fashioned clothing, men and women with skin pale from long submersion, reaching toward the glass from the impossible depths within. One face pressed close to the inner surface. A woman with dark hair and eyes like pools of seawater. Her mouth moved, forming words I could almost understand. Something about coral that lived and sang. About cargo that called the sea to come and claim it. About how the deep waters never forgot what belonged to them. I stumbled backward, my rational mind screaming that this was impossible, that I was hallucinating from stress or lack of sleep. But the woman's face remained, and her mouth kept moving, telling me things I didn't want to hear. The coral had been alive in ways that biology couldn't explain. It had sung on the ship's deck, calling to every marine creature for miles around. Schools of fish had followed the Cantadora for days, and dolphins had beached themselves on nearby shores, trying to reach the source of the song. The cargo had been restless, homesick for depths that existed beyond ordinary geography. When the ship sank, it hadn't been destroyed. It had simply gone home, carrying its passengers and crew to serve as voices in the choir that the coral needed. And now, piece by piece, through the reclaimed wood of its hull, it was building a new home in the world above. I looked around the lobby and saw what I'd been too distracted to notice before. The walls seemed farther away than they should be, and the carpet had taken on a wave-like pattern. The elevator doors showed scenes of underwater gardens, and the concierge desk was covered in what looked like barnacles in the dim lighting. The spiral was expanding beyond the tank, transforming the space around it. The hotel was being claimed, room by room, guest by guest. I thought of the complaints about strange dreams, about hearing songs in the night. The visitors weren't just experiencing hallucinations, they were being prepared, gradually acclimated to life in deeper waters. I grabbed my equipment and rushed for the exit, but the lobby doors seemed impossibly distant. Each step felt like moving through water, and the singing grew louder, more insistent. Voices I recognized now, passengers from a ship that sank over a century ago, calling for me to join their eternal voyage. Behind me, the glass of the aquarium began to bow outward, and I heard the first trickle of water spilling onto the marble floor. The woman's face was still there, still moving her mouth, but now I could hear her clearly. The deep waters are patient. The deep waters are kind. Come down, and join us in the endless home. I reached my car somehow, though I couldn't remember crossing the parking lot. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the hotel still standing, still lit, still normal. But I could hear the singing through my closed windows, and the sensation of water in my lungs stayed with me for miles. The next morning, I submitted my report to the hotel management, recommending immediate closure of the aquarium for structural safety concerns. I never mentioned the faces in the glass or the expanding spiral. Who would believe such things? Even now, writing this account, I question my own memories. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the singing. And when I look in mirrors, especially mirrors near water, I sometimes see that woman's face looking back at me. Her mouth still moves, still forms the same invitation. The hotel remains open. The aquarium still spirals in its lobby, drawing visitors who stay longer than they planned and leave with dreams of underwater gardens. I drive past it sometimes, unable to stop myself, and each time the building looks a little different, a little more like a ship, a little more ready to sail away to depths that don't appear on any map. I tell myself it was stress, overwork, too many late nights studying marine biology. I take medication for anxiety now, and it helps with the singing, mostly. But yesterday, I found sand in my shoes, and I haven't been to the beach in months. And this morning, when I brushed my teeth, the water from the tap tasted like salt. The deep waters are patient. The deep waters are kind, and I think they're still calling. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the maintenance corridor hummed their familiar tune, casting that sickly green pallor over everything. 23 years I'd been keeping the Meridian Tower running smooth, and in all that time, I'd never heard complaints quite like these. It's coming from the elevator shaft. Mrs. Chen from the 15th floor had insisted, her voice tight with exhaustion. Every night around 3 a.m., like machinery grinding, but wrong somehow. The others described it differently. Mr. Rodriguez called it whispers behind metal. The night security guard Thompson swore it sounded like footsteps pacing in an empty room, but they all pointed to the same place, the central elevator bank, specifically the shaft furthest left. I stood before the control panel, studying the digital readout. Elevators A through G were accounted for, their status lights blinking in reassuring patterns. But there at the bottom of the display was something I'd noticed before, but never questioned. A grayed-out button labeled 0. My supervisor, Martinez, had mentioned it once during my first week. Some kind of service elevator, he'd said, decommissioned years ago. Buildings so old, half the systems were grandfathered in from the original construction. Never thought much about it until now. The grinding sound started as I stood there, a low mechanical groan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from any of the active elevators. I'd checked their logs obsessively over the past week. Whatever was making that noise lived somewhere else entirely. I pressed my hand against the wall beside the leftmost shaft. The vibration traveled up my arm, a rhythm that felt almost organic, like breathing, if breathing required gears and cables. The building's blueprint room occupied a forgotten corner of the third basement level, buried beneath decades of filing cabinets and obsolete equipment manuals. I'd been down there exactly twice in my career, once during orientation, once to retrieve schematics for a water main repair. The air always felt thick down there, heavy with the weight of accumulated time. I found what I was looking for tucked behind a stack of HVAC modifications from the 80s, the original elevator specifications. The paper had yellowed to the color of old bone, and the ink had faded in places, but the diagrams were clear enough. 8 elevator shafts, not 7. The leftmost shaft, elevator 0, descended 2 levels below the lowest basement. According to the blueprint, it accessed something called sub-level gamma, which was marked with a notation I'd never seen before. Quantum Transport Research Platform, project status, incomplete. The timestamp on the document was 1987. The building had been completed in 1989. My hands were shaking as I photographed the blueprint with my phone. The notation felt like a splinter in my mind, something that didn't belong in the orderly world of maintenance schedules and equipment logs. Quantum transport. The words carried a weight that made my chest tight. I made copies of everything. The blueprints, the installation permits, even a few memo fragments that had somehow survived the decades. One memo, dated October 15th, 1987, caught my attention. Transport platform experiencing temporal displacement issues. Recommend immediate suspension of testing until synchronization protocols can be established. Mirror effect becoming more pronounced. Personnel report disorientation and identity confusion during proximity to active platform. The memo was signed by someone named Dr. Elizabeth Vance, project director. I'd never heard of her, but the company letterhead matched the building's original developers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words kept cycling through my head. Mirror effect, temporal displacement, identity confusion. I found myself standing at my apartment window, staring down at the city lights, wondering how many other buildings contained secrets like this. How many maintenance workers had found documentation that made them question everything they thought they knew about their workplace. The next morning I arrived early. The building was nearly empty, just a handful of early commuters and the cleaning crew finishing their rounds. I made my way to the elevator control room, a cramped space behind the main lobby that housed the central computer systems. The master control panel was a mix of old and new technology, analog switches beside digital displays, cables snaking between components that had been installed decades apart. I'd serviced this system hundreds of times, but now I was looking for something specific. I found it buried in the auxiliary controls, a manual override switch labeled Emergency Service Access, Level 0. The switch was covered by a clear plastic guard, the kind designed to prevent accidental activation. Beside it, a small LED sat dark and lifeless. I lifted the guard. The switch underneath was worn smooth, as if it had been used recently and frequently. That didn't make sense. According to every record I'd seen, Elevator 0 had been offline for over 30 years. The grinding sound started again, right on schedule. 3 a.m., just like Mrs. Chen had said. But it was morning now, which meant either the sound wasn't tied to a specific time, or something else was keeping track of hours in a way that didn't match the outside world. I flipped the switch. The LED came to life, pulsing red like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the walls, machinery hummed to life. Not the familiar sound of the regular elevators, but something deeper, more complex. The vibration in the floor changed, taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. The main elevator bank shifted. Where 7 sets of doors had stood moments before, an 8th door materialized at the leftmost position. Not appeared, materialized. Like it had always been there and I'd simply failed to notice it until this moment. The door was identical to the others in every way except one. Instead of brushed steel, its surface seemed to absorb light, creating a subtle visual distortion that made my eyes water when I looked directly at it. I approached slowly, my maintenance key ring heavy in my hand. The call button beside the door was already illuminated, though I hadn't pressed it. When I reached for it, my reflection appeared on the door's surface. but something was wrong with it. The reflection moved a fraction of a second after I did, like a delayed video feed. The door opened. The interior of Elevator Zero was wrong in ways that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. The dimensions were impossible, larger inside than outside, with walls that seemed to curve inward while somehow remaining perfectly straight. The button panel showed floors I recognized, plus several labeled with symbols I'd never seen before. At the bottom of the panel, below the basement levels, was a single button marked G, the Greek letter Gamma. I stepped inside. The floor felt solid enough, but it seemed to shift slightly under my weight, as if the entire elevator car was floating rather than suspended by cables. The doors closed with a soft whisper instead of the usual mechanical click. I pressed the Gamma button. The descent felt wrong from the first moment. Instead of the familiar sensation of downward movement, it was as if the world above was rising away from me. The elevator car remained perfectly still while reality rearranged itself around it. My ears popped, but not from pressure change, from something else entirely, something that felt like the air itself was being stretched. The lights in the elevator car began to flicker, but not randomly. The pattern was rhythmic, almost like Morse code. As the flickering intensified, I began to see shapes in the gaps between light and darkness. Shadows that moved independently of any source, forming patterns that resembled circuit diagrams or neural networks. Then I realized the shadows looked like the building's blueprints. The elevator car shuddered to a stop. The doors opened. Beyond them lay a corridor that defied every law of architecture I'd ever learned. The hallway stretched in both directions further than should have been possible, given the building's footprint. The walls were covered in the same light-absorbing material as the elevator door, creating a visual effect that made distance impossible to judge. But the most disturbing feature was the mirrors. They lined both walls of the corridor, stretching from floor to ceiling, each one reflecting not the hallway itself, but different versions of it. In some reflections, the corridor was bright and sterile like a laboratory. In others, it was in ruins, cables hanging from the ceiling like mechanical vines. In a few, the corridor appeared to be flooded, dark water lapping at the edges of the mirror frames. I stepped out of the elevator. The floor beneath my feet felt solid, but each step produced an echo that came from the wrong direction, not from below, but from above, as if I were walking on the ceiling of an inverted room. In the mirrors, I could see myself walking. But like my reflection in the elevator door, each mirror showed me acting a few seconds behind my actual movements. Worse, the reflections weren't identical. In some mirrors, I appeared to be wearing different clothes. In others, I looked older or younger, or was accompanied by shadowy figures I couldn't identify. One reflection showed me carrying a clipboard, writing frantically on pages I couldn't read. Another showed me standing perfectly still, staring directly out of the mirror with eyes that held an expression of absolute terror. I walked deeper into the corridor, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, some kind of elaborate art installation, or a hallucination brought on by stress and too little sleep. But my body knew better. Every nerve was screaming that I was in a place that existed outside normal physical laws. The corridor branched ahead, splitting into multiple pathways that curved away into darkness. I chose the left path arbitrarily, and immediately noticed that my reflection in the mirrors was choosing different routes. Some of my mirror selves went right, others continued straight. A few turned back toward the elevator. But one reflection, in a mirror about 20 feet down the left corridor, showed me standing exactly where I was standing, making the same choice to go left, at the exact same moment. This reflection moved in perfect synchronization with my actual movements. I waved at it. It waved back, perfectly timed. I mouthed the word, "Hello." It mouthed the word back. Then it mouthed something else. Something I hadn't said. I couldn't read lips well enough to understand what my reflection was trying to tell me, but the expression on its face was urgent, desperate. It kept pointing over my shoulder, back toward the elevator. I turned around. The corridor behind me was empty, exactly as I'd left it. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. The mirror showed an empty corridor, but not the one I was standing in. This corridor had different lights, different shadows, and in the distance, I could see a figure walking away from me. The figure looked like me, but was wearing the maintenance uniform I'd owned 5 years ago, before the company changed suppliers. I remembered that uniform clearly. It had a small tear near the left pocket where I'd caught it on a ventilation grate during a particularly difficult repair job. I followed the corridors for what felt like hours, though my watch had stopped working the moment I'd entered the elevator. Each path led to new configurations of mirrors, new reflections, new versions of myself engaged in activities I couldn't remember performing. In one reflection, I was reading from the same memo I'd found in the blueprint room, but the text was different, written in a language that looked almost like English but used symbols I didn't recognize. In another, I was speaking animatedly to someone outside the mirror's range, gesturing at what appeared to be a complex diagram covered in equations. The most disturbing reflection showed me sleeping in what looked like the maintenance room back in the building. But the room was configured wrong, equipment in the wrong places, walls covered in monitors displaying incomprehensible data streams. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a place below the building. It was a place between places, where different versions of events played out simultaneously. The quantum transport platform Dr. Vance had mentioned in her memo wasn't just incomplete, it was broken in a way that had created cracks in reality itself. The grinding sounds I'd been hearing weren't mechanical failures. They were the sounds of time and space grinding against each other, trying to reconcile incompatible versions of the same events. I found what might have been the platform at the center of the maze. It was a circular room filled with equipment I couldn't identify, devices that seemed to be part electronic and part organic, cables that pulsed with their own internal light, screens displaying readouts in mathematical notation that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the room stood a podium holding a thick manual, bound in what looked like metal rather than paper. The title page read, Temporal Synchronization Protocols, Meridian Quantum Transport Platform, Final Revision, Dr. Elizabeth Vance, October 1987. I opened the manual. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in multiple different handwritings, all of which looked like my own. Some notes were in pencil, others in pen, a few in red ink that might have been marker. The handwriting styles were similar but distinct, as if written by the same person at different ages or in different mental states. One note, written in careful block letters, read, The platform creates temporal echoes. Each use produces multiple potential outcomes, all equally real. The mirror effect allows observation of parallel decision trees. Warning, prolonged exposure leads to identity fragmentation. Another note in hurried cursive said, I keep coming back here. Every version of me keeps coming back. We're all trying to understand, but understanding changes us, and changing creates new versions. How many of me are there now? At the bottom of the page, in shaky handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone with trembling hands, the elevator only goes down. It never goes up. We're all still here, all still trying to fix it, all still failing. The building doesn't know which version is real anymore. I closed the manual and backed away from the podium. The room's mirrors showed dozens of versions of me, all at different stages of reading the same manual, all wearing expressions that ranged from confusion to terror to a kind of resigned acceptance. One mirror showed me as an old man, still wearing a maintenance uniform, still carrying the same key ring, reading the manual for what appeared to be the 1,000th time. Another showed me young, maybe just out of high school, staring at the manual with fresh eyes that held no recognition of its contents. A third showed me exactly as I was now, but instead of backing away from the podium, that version of me was writing additional notes in the manual's margins. I needed to leave. I needed to get back to the elevator and return to the world I understood, where maintenance problems had logical solutions and mirrors showed only what was actually in front of them. But when I turned to retrace my steps, I found that the corridor layout had changed. The path I'd taken to reach the platform no longer existed. Instead, I faced a dozen different corridors, each leading in directions that seemed to violate the basic geometry of three-dimensional space. I chose one at random and began walking. The mirrors in this corridor showed me making different choices, taking different paths, but they all led to the same destination, a small room containing nothing but a single elevator door. The door was identical to the one I'd entered through, complete with the same light-absorbing surface and the same slightly delayed reflection. But when I pressed the call button, nothing happened. The elevator was already there, doors open, but the interior was completely dark. I stepped inside. Instead of the familiar button panel, the wall held a single switch labeled Return to Baseline Reality, YN. I flipped the switch to Y. The ascent felt like waking up from a dream within a dream within a dream. Layers of unreality peeled away as the elevator rose, each layer taking with it some piece of what I'd experienced below. By the time the doors opened, I could barely remember why I'd gone down there in the first place. I stood in the familiar lobby of the Meridian Tower, surrounded by the morning rush of commuters heading to their offices. Everything looked exactly as it should. The elevator bank showed 7 doors, just as it always had. The control panel in the maintenance room displayed 7 elevators, A through G, all functioning normally. But in my pocket, I found a single page torn from a manual, covered in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. The text was a maintenance schedule for equipment I'd never seen before, dated for tomorrow, signed with my name in handwriting that was almost, but not exactly my own. And sometimes, usually around 3 a.m., I still hear the grinding sounds coming from somewhere in the walls. Mrs. Chen has stopped complaining about them. In fact, when I asked her about it last week, she looked at me with complete confusion and insisted she'd never reported any unusual noises. The strange thing is, I believe her. I've been checking the maintenance logs obsessively, looking for any record of my trip to the sub-basement level. There's nothing. According to every system in the building, Elevator 0 has never existed. But I know it's there. I can feel it sometimes, when I'm working late and the building is mostly empty. A presence behind the walls, a system running parallel to everything else, following its own logic and its own schedule. I've stopped looking for it. I've stopped investigating the blueprints or trying to locate Dr. Vance's research notes. Some problems aren't meant to be fixed, but late at night when I'm lying in bed and can't sleep, I find myself wondering, how many other maintenance workers have found that switch? How many versions of myself are still down there, still trying to understand, still writing notes in a manual that exists in too many places at once? And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I can swear I hear the sound of an elevator moving behind the walls of my apartment, carrying passengers to floors that don't exist in any building I've ever seen. The grinding sound is getting louder. Story 13. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 3 days when I first heard them. Hundreds of wind chimes singing in perfect unison across Millbrook Valley, their metallic voices rising from every abandoned porch and empty windowsill like a chorus of the departed. I stood on my cabin's deck at 4:47 a.m., digital weather station glowing green in the pre-dawn darkness, watching fog roll down the mountainside like slow-moving water. There wasn't even a whisper of wind. My breath misted in the 40-degree air as I pressed record on my voice memo app, documenting what should have been impossible. 23 years of amateur meteorology had taught me that wind chimes don't sing without wind, just as barometers don't lie and fog doesn't move with purpose. Yet here I was, watching tendrils of mist navigate between houses with deliberate precision, and listening to a symphony that had no conductor. The sound grew louder as the fog thickened, transforming from gentle tinkling into something that resonated in my chest cavity. I'd heard these chimes during previous fog events, but never with such intensity, never with such intention. The metallic tones seemed to layer upon themselves, creating harmonics that made my molars ache and my vision blur at the edges. I retreated inside and pulled up my weather logs. The pattern had been building for months. Every significant fog event coincided with the chimes, but the correlation was growing stronger. More chimes, longer duration, deeper penetration into the valley. Tonight felt different, felt final, though I couldn't articulate why. The local library's historical archives had yielded fragments of information over the past weeks. Millbrook Valley had been larger once, a proper mining town with nearly 300 residents. That was before the landslide of 1987, triggered by an unusually dense fog that had lingered for 6 days. No deaths, the newspaper clipping insisted, though 17 families had simply vanished during the event. Not buried, not crushed, vanished. They'd returned weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. Speaking of dreams filled with reversed mountains and inverted skies, the mining operation had closed shortly after, the quartz veins exhausted, they claimed. But I'd found the geological survey reports. The veins hadn't been empty, they'd been singing. Now, standing in my kitchen as fog pressed against the windows like searching fingers, I understood why the old-timers had left. Why only 12 families remained in a valley that could support hundreds. The wind chimes weren't decorations left behind by departed residents. They were instruments, crafted from the very metal that had once lined those singing quartz veins. I tested my hypothesis by stepping outside again. The fog had advanced, swallowing my weather station, my pickup truck, everything beyond 15 feet. The chime's song had evolved, no longer random tinklings, but structured melodies that seemed to emanate from specific locations throughout the valley. I followed the sound toward the Hendricks place, abandoned since old Tom had packed up and left 3 months ago, muttering about voices in the walls. The fog moved around me as I walked, never quite obscuring my path but always limiting my vision. My flashlight beam scattered uselessly in the moisture-saturated air, creating a soft globe of illumination that revealed nothing beyond its boundaries. The chimes grew louder with each step, their metallic voices joining in complex harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from wind-powered instruments. Tom's wind chime hung from his front porch eave, 37 tubes of varying lengths that I'd counted during my investigations. Now they swayed in perfect coordination despite the absence of any breeze, their movement too precise, too synchronized. I reached out to touch the nearest tube and jerked my hand back as an electric sensation ran up my arm. The metal was warm, far warmer than the surrounding air, and it vibrated with a frequency I felt in my bones. That's when I heard the first voice. It wasn't speech exactly, more like the suggestion of words carried on metallic tones. The sound seemed to emerge from the chime itself, a whisper that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the auditory centers of my brain. I strained to understand, pressing closer, and caught fragments that might have been names. Sarah, Michael, come back. The other side. My rational mind cataloged explanations, auditory hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and stress, pareidolia causing me to hear patterns in random sounds, the effects of infrasound generated by some unknown geological process. But my gut knew better. Something was trying to communicate through those chimes, something that understood the unique properties of quartz vein metal and how it responded to moisture and atmospheric pressure. I documented everything with my phone's voice recorder, though the playback would later reveal only the metallic chiming and my own increasingly agitated breathing. The fog continued to advance, and I realized it was hurting me, guiding my movement through the valley with deliberate precision. Every time I tried to return to my cabin, the path would become obscured, forcing me toward specific locations where the chimes sang loudest. The Methodist church sat at the valley's center, its simple white steeple now invisible in the thickening mist. I'd avoided it during my previous investigations, partly from respect for the sacred space, partly because something about its silence had always unnerved me. Now the fog pushed me toward its front steps, and I discovered why it had seemed so quiet. The church had no wind chimes. Instead, the entire building hummed with that same harmonic resonance I'd felt from the individual chimes. The white clapboard siding vibrated subtly, creating a bass note that my diaphragm felt more than my ears heard. I pressed my palm against the wall and gasped as the vibration intensified, transmitting sensations that weren't quite sound and weren't quite electricity. Inside, the pew sat empty in perfect rows, but the air itself seemed occupied. The fog had found ways to enter, through gaps in the window frames, under doors, through vents, and it moved with purpose among the seats, forming vague suggestions of human shapes that dispersed when I looked directly at them. The harmonics were strongest here, creating a cathedral of sound that made my skull feel too small for my brain. I walked the center aisle, my footsteps echoing strangely in the humming air, and noticed that each pew bore small metal plaques, not memorial plates or donation acknowledgments, but tiny rectangles of the same warm metal I'd found in the chimes. My fingers traced one plaque's surface and found it covered in microscopic etchings, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The fog coalesced more densely near the altar, forming shapes that almost resembled people standing in a congregation. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but the figures persisted. They faced away from me, toward something I couldn't see, their forms translucent and shifting but undeniably present. The metallic harmonics reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. That's when I understood. The families hadn't disappeared in 1987. They'd found a way through. The fog wasn't weather, it was a doorway. The quartz veins hadn't been exhausted. They'd been opened, creating a resonance chamber that spanned both sides of reality. The wind chimes weren't instruments left behind by departed residents. They were beacons, calling back to those who'd crossed over, inviting them to return and bring others with them. I turned to flee and found the church doors sealed by fog so dense it felt solid against my palms. The congregation of shapes had begun to turn, their not-quite faces focusing on me with attention that made my skin crawl. The harmonics shifted into something that might have been words, might have been screaming, might have been laughter. "Join us," the metal voices seemed to whisper. "The other side is better. No weather to predict, no pressure to measure, no loneliness to endure. Just the eternal song of the mountain's heart." I pressed harder against the doors, but the fog held them closed with surprising resistance. The shapes in the pews were moving now, not walking but flowing like liquid toward the aisle. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized I had two choices: surrender to whatever waited on the other side of that resonance, or find another way out. The window behind the altar showed cracks in its old glass, hairline fractures that had been there for decades. I grabbed a hymnal from the nearest pew and hurled it with desperate strength. The glass shattered outward, letting in a rush of normal air that disrupted the chamber's perfect acoustics. The harmonics faltered, the shapes wavered, and the fog loosened its grip on the doors. I ran. My cabin seemed impossibly distant as I stumbled through streets I'd walked for years but now felt alien and threatening. The fog pursued but couldn't maintain its coherence in the open air, dispersing into natural weather patterns that my instruments could actually measure. Behind me, the church's broken window had silenced its song, but wind chimes throughout the valley continued their metallic chorus, fainter now but persistent. I made it home as the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. My weather station showed normal readings, humidity dropping, pressure rising, wind speed registering the gentle breeze that now actually moved the fog in predictable patterns. But when I checked my voice recordings from the night, I found only static and the sound of my own labored breathing. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've noticed changes. The fog comes more frequently, and each time the chimes sing a little longer. My neighbors, what few remain, have begun mentioning strange dreams about reversed mountains and inverted skies. Mrs. Patterson asked me yesterday if I'd ever heard voices in the weather, then laughed nervously and changed the subject. Young Dr. Reeves at the clinic has been prescribing sleeping pills to half the valley, though he admits he's been having trouble sleeping himself. I've started packing my equipment, planning to relocate to a nice flat town where fog behaves according to meteorological principles and metal doesn't sing without reason. But every evening, as the barometric pressure begins to drop, I find myself hesitating. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed in that church, if I'd let the resonance take me wherever it was calling. Part of me wonders if the other side really is better. Tonight, the pressure is dropping again. The fog is gathering on the mountainside, and I can already hear the first tentative notes from the wind chimes throughout the valley. I should leave now, while I still can, while I still want to. But I'm beginning to think that wanting to leave and being able to leave might be two very different things. The fog is patient after all. It has been patient for decades, calling back its lost children one by one. And I'm starting to suspect that some forms of weather aren't governed by atmospheric conditions at all. Some forms of weather are governed by hunger. Recording ends. Story 14. The first thing you notice about the Avalon Grand isn't its faded gilt moldings or the dust motes dancing through Art Deco sunbeams. It's the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty building, but the heavy, expectant hush of a theater moments before the curtain rises. I've been the caretaker here for 3 months now, preparing this 1920s monument for its grand reopening, and that silence follows me through every corridor like a faithful dog. The 5th floor held its secrets behind a canvas tarp that had grown stiff with decades of neglect. Room 517 was supposed to be the crown jewel suite, according to the architectural plans. But when I finally climbed those stairs with my crowbar and cleaning supplies, I found something else entirely. The room was empty except for an enormous mirror that dominated the far wall, easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, its ornate bronze frame carved with theatrical masks that seemed to shift expressions in my peripheral vision. The tarp came away with a sound like old skin peeling, releasing the musty scent of trapped time. Beneath, the mirror's surface was pristine, impossibly clear for something that had been covered since the 1940s. I stood there for a moment, tools in hand, staring at my reflection. Then I noticed the lag. It wasn't much at first, maybe a second, perhaps less. I raised my hand to test it, and my reflection followed a heartbeat behind, like a bad video call. I tilted my head left, and my mirror self hesitated before mimicking the movement. The rational part of my mind, the part that had learned to ignore the building's settling groans and unexplained drafts, suggested it was probably an optical illusion. Old mirrors developed imperfections. Light played tricks. But my reflection was staring directly at me while I was looking away. I left the room quickly that day, telling myself I'd return tomorrow with proper cleaning equipment. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had mentioned something about the 5th floor having quirks, but she'd been vague about specifics. Hotel management rarely volunteers information about rooms that might spook guests, even long-dead guests. That night, alone in my basement apartment beneath the hotel's foundation, I dreamed of bronze masks laughing silently. I woke with the taste of old copper in my mouth and the unshakable feeling that someone had been watching me sleep. The next morning brought rain that drummed against the Avalon's tall windows like impatient fingers. I found myself drawn back to room 517, ostensibly to finish the cleaning job I'd abandoned. The mirror waited, unchanged, reflecting the gray morning light with disturbing clarity. This time, when I approached, the delay in my reflection was more pronounced, nearly 3 seconds, long enough to notice that my mirror self wasn't quite keeping pace with my movements, long enough to see that my reflection was making different facial expressions. I stood perfectly still, watching as my mirror image continued moving, adjusting his collar, running a hand through his hair, movements I wasn't making. He looked tired, this other me, with deeper lines around his eyes and a slump to his shoulders that spoke of burdens I didn't remember carrying. When he finally stopped moving and looked directly at me, his mouth formed words I couldn't hear. He was trying to tell me something. I spent the rest of that day in the hotel's archives, a musty room in the sub-basement where previous owners had stored decades of paperwork. The Avalon's history read like a collection of ghost stories, mysterious disappearances, unexplained accidents, guests who checked out in the middle of the night claiming their rooms were occupied by previous visitors. But it was the folder marked Special Installations, 1925, that made my hands shake. Professor Aldrich Thorne, stage name the Temporal Maestro, had been a popular performer in the 1920s. His specialty was time-based illusions, making pocket watches run backward, causing flowers to age and bloom in reverse, convincing audiences he could glimpse fragments of the future. The hotel had commissioned him to create a unique experience for the Crown Jewel Suite, something that would attract wealthy patrons seeking entertainment beyond the ordinary. The installation notes were written in Thorne's spidery handwriting. The mirror serves not as a window to tomorrow, but as a reservoir for yesterday. Each reflection leaves a residue, a temporal echo that accumulates with exposure. Guests will witness their own futures by observing the behavior patterns established by previous visitors. But the final entry, dated 6 months later, told a different story. The device exceeds intended parameters. Subjects report increasing delay in reflective response. Temporal echoes show signs of autonomous behavior. Recommend immediate discontinuation. The mirror had been covered and sealed the following week. By the third night, the delay had stretched to nearly 10 seconds. I found myself returning to room 517 despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away. Something was compelling me upward, as if the building itself was drawing me to that mirror like iron filings to a magnet. This time, when I looked into the glass, I saw not just one delayed reflection, but several. 3 versions of myself stood in that silvered space, each one slightly different, each one moving to their own rhythm. The closest looked exactly like me, but moved with the confidence I'd lost years ago. The second appeared older, grayer, with scars on his hands I didn't recognize. The third was barely visible in the background, translucent and flickering like a poor television signal. They were all looking at me. The oldest stepped forward, pressing his palm against the glass from the inside. His mouth moved urgently, and though I couldn't hear him, I could read his lips. "Don't come back. You're feeding it." But I couldn't stop. Each night the pull grew stronger, the need to understand what was happening overwhelming my better judgment. The mirror was collecting me, piece by piece, reflection by reflection. And each version trapped inside was a fragment of my life, a moment when I'd made a choice that led me to this room, this building, this impossible situation. The fourth night brought a revelation that made my blood freeze. As I stood before the mirror, watching my collection of selves gesture frantically from within the glass, I noticed something else. Other faces, dozens of them, layered behind my own reflections like photographs exposed multiple times on the same frame. Hotel guests from decades past, all trapped in their own temporal loops, all trying to warn the living about the price of prolonged exposure. The mirror wasn't just storing reflections, it was storing souls. I understood then why Thorne had called it a reservoir. Every person who looked into that glass left something behind, a piece of their essence that accumulated over time. The longer the exposure, the more substantial the echo became, until eventually the reflection gained enough autonomy to exist independently of its source. And once that happened, the original would begin to fade. I could feel it happening to me. Each morning I woke feeling slightly less solid, as if my edges were becoming blurred. Colors seemed muted, sounds became distant, and food had lost all taste. Meanwhile, my reflections grew more vivid, more real, more desperate to escape their glass prison. On the 7th night, I made a decision that terrified me. I would try to communicate with them, to understand what they needed. Perhaps if I could satisfy their demands, I could break the cycle before it claimed me completely. The oldest version of myself was the most coherent. When I placed my palm against the glass to match his, I felt a cold shock that ran through my entire body. Suddenly, I could hear him, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. His voice was my voice, but hollowed out by years of imprisonment. "You have to stop coming here. Every visit makes us stronger and you weaker. Soon we'll have enough substance to switch places." The younger version, the confident one, pushed forward. "Don't listen to him. He's been here the longest. He's forgotten what it's like to be alive. We can all escape if you just keep feeding the mirror. We need your substance to break free." The third, the flickering one, was harder to hear. "There's no escape. The mirror doesn't give, it only takes. We're warnings of what you'll become if you don't leave now." 3 voices, 3 versions of my future, each offering a different path. But were they really different? Or just stages of the same inevitable decline? I pressed my other palm against the glass, trying to understand, and felt myself pulled forward slightly, as if the mirror's surface had become permeable. That's when I realized the truth that Thorne had discovered too late. The mirror didn't show the future by reflecting it. It created the future by consuming the present. Every choice I'd made, every path that had led me to this moment, was the result of temporal echoes bleeding backward through time. I wasn't looking at my possible futures. I was looking at the versions of myself that had already made the journey I was about to make. The mirror wasn't a window. It was a trap designed to ensure its own continued existence. But understanding the trap and escaping it were two different things. As I tried to pull my hands away from the glass, I found they wouldn't move. The surface had become soft, yielding, and my palms were sinking into it like warm mercury. My reflections were pulling me in, their faces desperate with the hunger of the long imprisoned. "Please," the oldest whispered, his voice growing stronger as mine grew weaker. "We've been waiting so long to feel sunlight again, to taste food, to be real. Just let us trade places. You'll understand everything once you're in here. Time moves differently. The years will pass like minutes." The confident version laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't make it sound like a sacrifice. He'll have eternity to figure out how to escape. We did our time. Now it's his turn." The flickering one said nothing, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke volumes. As the mirror pulled me deeper, I felt my consciousness beginning to split. Part of me was already on the other side, looking out at my own body with growing clarity and hunger. I could see the terror in my living eyes, could feel the warm blood flowing through the veins of the man I was about to replace. It would be so easy to just let go, to accept the trade and let my strongest reflection take my place in the world. But in that moment of dual existence, I also saw something else. The truth about Professor Thorne. He hadn't died or disappeared, as the record suggested. He was still in the mirror, but so deep in the layers of reflection that he'd become almost invisible. I could see him there, in the very back, mouthing the same word over and over. "Run." With the last of my strength, I wrenched my hands free from the glass surface. The sound was like tearing fabric, and the shock sent me stumbling backward. My reflection screamed in fury and desperation, pounding on the glass from the inside, but I didn't look back. I ran from that room and didn't stop until I was in my car, driving away from the Avalon Grand with no destination in mind except anywhere else. That was 3 weeks ago. I never returned to collect my belongings or my final paycheck. Mrs. Chen left several voicemails asking where I was, mentioning that the hotel's reopening had been delayed due to technical difficulties with one of the premium suites. I deleted them all without responding, but here's what keeps me awake at night. Yesterday, while shaving in my new apartment's bathroom mirror, I noticed a slight delay in my reflection. Just a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but definitely there. And when I look very carefully at my reflection's eyes, I can swear I see the faint outline of an ornate bronze frame around the edges of the glass. The mirror, it seems, doesn't need me to return to room 517. It's learned to follow me, growing stronger with each glimpse I catch of myself in any reflective surface. The Avalon Grand was just its home base, not its prison. And somewhere in the glass, 3 versions of myself are still waiting patiently for their turn at freedom, knowing that eventually I'll have to look at my reflection again. After all, everyone has to face themselves sooner or later.